Close your eyes if you want to, or just let your eyes go soft and unfocused, because tonight we're settling in with the strange, sprawling, 25-year story of one of the most talked about cartoons ever put on television. We're talking about Family Guy, not the jokes you already know by heart, the real story behind it, the drawings in a college dorm room, the dog that almost wasn't a dog, the baby who was never supposed to be lovable, the network that canceled the show twice and then begged it to come back. Get comfortable, because there is a lot of ground to cover, and none of us are in a rush tonight. Let's start at the very beginning, because almost nobody remembers it correctly. Family Guy did not begin as a television pitch. It began as a thesis film. In 1995, a young animation student named Seth Woodbury MacFarlane was finishing his degree at the Rhode Island School of Design, and like every student in every art program in the world, he needed a senior project. He made a short film called The Life of Larry. It featured a heavy-set, none-too-bright middle-aged man named Larry Cummings, his patient wife named Lois, his overweight teenage son named Milt, and most importantly, his cynical, talking dog named Steve. If you have ever seen a single frame of Family Guy, you already know exactly where this is going. Larry would become Peter, Steve would become Brian. The wife name didn't even need to change. It was already Lois. What makes this part of the story almost unbelievable is the path that little student film took to get noticed. One of MacFarlane's professors at RISD was so impressed with The Life of Larry that he sent it, without much fanfare, to the animation studio Hanna-Barbera. This was the legendary company behind Scooby-Doo, the Flintstones, and Yogi Bear, and somebody there watched a film made by a college kid in a dorm room and decided it was worth a phone call. MacFarlane was hired right out of school, moved to Los Angeles, and spent the next few years working as both an animator and a writer on shows like Johnny Bravo, Dexter's Laboratory, and Cow and Chicken. He has said that, of all of those jobs, Johnny Bravo gave him the most freedom to develop his own writing voice, because unlike the other shows, it actually used a traditional script writing process rather than just storyboards, but he never let go of Larry. In 1996, while still working for Hanna-Barbera, MacFarlane revisited the character and made a sequel short called Larry and Steve. This one leaned a little more into the dynamic between the dim, lovable man and his sharp, world-weary dog, and it aired in 1997 as part of Cartoon Network's world premiere Toons series, sometimes also referred to as What a Cartoon. If you go back and watch it now, you can hear Brian's voice already forming in Steve's lines. You can see the bones of Quagmire in a minor pilot character who briefly appears. The whole world of Family Guy was already quietly assembling itself, piece by piece, years before a single episode existed. Executives at Fox eventually caught wind of these shorts. There's a detail in this part of the story that a lot of people get wrong. Family Guy was almost not a standalone show at all. The original plan was for these animated bits to be used as short inserts for the sketch comedy show Mad TV. That deal eventually fell apart because Mad TV's budget simply could not support real animation production, but it kept MacFarlane's name in the building at Fox. Soon after, the network's alternative comedy executives, a pair named Leslie Collins and Mike Darnell, made him an offer that sounds almost absurd in hindsight. They gave him $50,000, a tiny fraction of what a normal animated pilot would cost, and told him to make something they could decide on. MacFarlane has described what came next as one of the hardest stretches of his life. He spent close to 6 months with almost no sleep, hand-drawing, writing, and voicing an entire 15-minute presentation by himself in his kitchen. Picture that for a second. One guy, alone, animating every frame of what would eventually become a multi-billion-dollar media franchise, fueled by nothing but ambition and a tight deadline. He pitched the finished short to Fox on May 15th, 1998. The executives loved it. By July of that year, Fox announced they had purchased the show for a January 1999 debut, and the Griffin family as we now know them was officially born. The premiere date was no accident either. Family Guy debuted on January 31st, 1999, immediately following Super Bowl 33. If you know anything about television scheduling, you know that's about as prime a piece of real estate as a brand new show can possibly get, because tens of millions of people are already sitting on their couches with the television already on. And it worked. That very first episode pulled in roughly 22 million viewers. For a brand new, untested animated show airing in primetime on a major network, that is an enormous number, the kind of debut most shows in television history never come close to matching. And right there, at the absolute peak of the show's earliest success, is where I want you to pause and think about your own evening for a second. Wherever you're listening to this from, whatever city, whatever country, whatever quiet corner of your house you've tucked yourself into tonight, go ahead and drop a comment letting me know the time and the place you're tuning in from. I love seeing where this little community of night owls and early risers is scattered across the world. And if you haven't already, go ahead and hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one of these. Now, let's keep going, because the story of how this show almost died, twice, is even stranger than how it began. Family Guy's first season finished at number 33 in the Nielsen ratings, a genuinely respectable showing for a freshman series, especially an animated one airing against established sitcoms. But success in television is rarely just about whether people like a show. It is just as often about whether a network knows how to take care of it, and Fox did not. For season 2, the network moved Family Guy to Thursday nights, putting it directly against Frasier, one of the most beloved and highly rated comedies on all of television at the time. The ratings dropped immediately. Rather than giving the show room to find its footing, Fox moved it again, this time to a slot where it found itself losing badly to Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? By the time season 3 rolled around in the summer of 2001, Fox had shuffled the show to yet another time slot, Thursdays at 8, right into a head-on collision with Friends, then the single most-watched comedy in America, and the early seasons of the reality competition juggernaut Survivor. No show, however good, was surviving that gauntlet. The ratings collapsed under the weight of that competition, and in 2002, Fox canceled Family Guy. One final episode from that third season did not even air on the network. It simply sat on a shelf, unseen, for more than a year. Here is where the story takes its first truly remarkable turn, the kind of plot twist that almost never happens in the television business. Once a show is canceled, it is canceled. That is usually the entire story. Writers move on, actors take other jobs, the sets get torn down, and the show fades into the background of pop culture history. But something unusual happened with Family Guy's reruns. Fox, having essentially written the show off, sold the rerun rights to Cartoon Network for what the president of 20th Century Fox Television later described as almost nothing, because at the time, almost nobody believed there was real value left in a canceled cartoon. Cartoon Network slotted those reruns into their late-night Adult Swim block, and the reaction caught everyone off guard. Family Guy premiered in reruns on Adult Swim on April 20th, 2003, and almost overnight it became the single highest-rated program on the entire block. It didn't just do well. It dominated, outperforming both cable and broadcast competition in its time slot and boosting Adult Swim's overall viewership by an astonishing 239%. At the exact same time, something just as unusual was happening on store shelves. The DVD sets of the first 2 seasons hit the market, and they did not just sell, they exploded. The combined sales of those early season sets eventually topped 2.2 million copies, making the release the best-selling television DVD of 2003 and, at the time, the second best-selling television DVD ever made, trailing only the first season of Chappelle's Show. People were not simply tolerating the reruns. They were actively going out and purchasing a show that their own television network had decided wasn't worth keeping. A cult following had been quietly building in the dark, and it was growing fast enough that it was impossible to ignore. Fox noticed. By May of 2004, the network officially reversed course and ordered 35 new episodes, an order built almost entirely on the strength of DVD sales rather than traditional viewership numbers, which makes Family Guy the very first television series in history to be revived primarily because of how well it sold on disc. Season 4 premiered on May 1st, 2005. After a gap of roughly 3 years, drawing close to 12 million viewers on its return, proof that the audience that had built itself up in the shadows of Cancellation was very real and very ready to come back. The show was placed into Fox's new Sunday night animation block, sitting alongside The Simpsons, King of the Hill, and a brand new sibling show that MacFarlane had created during the hiatus, a series about a deeply patriotic, slightly unhinged CIA agent and his family. That 3-year gap mattered more than most casual viewers realize. When a show goes dark, its writing staff scatters. People take other jobs, sign other contracts, move on with their careers, because nobody can be expected to sit around for 3 years hoping a canceled show might someday return. MacFarlane has talked openly about how the show being pulled off the air repeatedly meant the team was constantly rebuilding the writer's room from scratch, bringing in new voices who naturally brought their own sensibilities and instincts to a show they did not originally build. The animation style changed too. Different seasons were handled by different studios, each with its own visual fingerprint, and astute viewers can often guess roughly which era of the show they're watching, just from the way the line work and movement feel on screen. Before we go further into the writers, the controversies, and the strange day-to-day mechanics of how an episode actually gets made, let's slow down again for a moment. If you're settling in tonight with the lights low, or maybe you've got this playing through a speaker somewhere across the room while you're getting ready for bed, take a second and tell me where in the world you're tucked in tonight. And don't forget that subscribe button is right there waiting for a tap if you want more of these long, slow deep dives. All right, let's keep wandering through this story. One of the most charming little secrets behind Family Guy involves something almost nobody outside the production actually witnesses, which is the recording booth itself. Unlike a lot of modern animated shows where actors record their lines separately and the audio gets stitched together in editing, Family Guy has, at various points in its history, recorded its principal cast together in the same room. Seth MacFarlane has spoken about how physically demanding it is on his voice to perform Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire, sometimes bouncing rapidly between all four characters within a single scene. In one interview, he described being almost merciless with his own voice, pushing through sessions even when he wasn't feeling well because the production schedule simply didn't allow for delays. He has joked that he treats his voice the way you'd treat an old car you're trying to get one more year out of, hammering it and hoping it holds together. The voices themselves have some wonderful little origin stories buried in them. Peter Griffin's voice, that nasal, almost cartoonish drawl, was inspired by a security guard MacFarlane used to overhear while he was a student at RISD. He and his friends found the man's particular cadence so unintentionally funny that the impression stuck in MacFarlane's head for years, until it eventually became the voice of one of the most recognizable cartoon characters of the 21st century. Chris Griffin's voice, performed by Seth Green, has an entirely different and slightly unsettling origin. According to interviews with the actor who originally auditioned for the role, Green was dared by a friend one night to do an impression of Buffalo Bill, the unsettling serial killer character from the film The Silence of the Lambs, reimagined as though that character were an awkward 11-year-old boy. The casting directors loved it, and that slightly off-kilter, breathy voice became Chris permanently. The show even nodded to this years later, having Chris reenact the infamous dance scene from that very film during a Season 7 episode, a wink to fans who had done their homework on where his voice actually came from. Meg Griffin's voice has its own quiet bit of trivia that surprises a lot of longtime viewers. In Season 1, Meg was voiced by actress Lacey Chabert, known to many for her role as Gretchen Wieners in Mean Girls and for voicing Eliza Thornberry on Nickelodeon. Chabert left the role after that first season, and starting in Season 2, Mila Kunis took over and has voiced the character ever since. Interestingly, Kunis does not actually perform Meg's singing parts. Those have historically been handled by veteran voice actress Tara Strong. It's a small detail, the kind of thing that slips past most casual fans entirely, but it's exactly the sort of behind-the-curtain fact that makes a show feel less like a finished product and more like a living, evolving thing built by dozens of hands over a quarter century. There's also a sobering little footnote buried in MacFarlane's personal history that connects directly to one of the darkest days in modern American history. On the morning of September 11, 2001, MacFarlane was scheduled to be on American Airlines Flight 11, one of the planes that was hijacked and crashed into the World Trade Center. He has explained in interviews that he missed that flight because of a late night out, an oversleeping mishap the next morning, and some confusion from his travel agent about his ticket. He arrived at the airport with only minutes to spare and missed boarding. It is the kind of detail that, once you know it, casts an odd, heavy shadow backward over everything that followed, a reminder that the entire 25-year history of this show, all the seasons, all the characters, all the controversy, exists because of a string of small, mundane delays on one particular morning. Let's talk now about the early creative core of the show, because the writer's room that built those first 3 seasons deserves real credit. MacFarlane assembled a team that included Chris Sheridan, Danny Smith, Gary Janetti, Ricky Blitt, Neil Goldman, Garrett Donovan, Matt Weitzman, and Mike Barker. This group helped shape not just the jokes, but the entire emotional architecture of the early show, the rhythm of how a Peter and Lois argument would resolve, the specific dryness of Brian's voice, the way Stewie's villainy was constructed scene by scene. There's even a small inside joke buried in the cast list. The recurring nerdy character Neil Goldman is named directly after one of the writers on staff. According to behind-the-scenes accounts, the rest of the writing room simply thought the real Neil Goldman fit the vibe of an awkward background character so well that they put his name on it, whether he loved the idea or not. MacFarlane was, in those early years, hands-on with nearly every part of production, from story-breaking to animation notes to the overall tone of the show. That kind of obsessive personal involvement from a creator in the first few seasons of a series is fairly common in television history. But what makes Family Guy's story a little different is how dramatically that involvement changed over time, and we're going to get into exactly when and why that shift happened a little later tonight. For now, let's sit with one more piece of trivia, something that connects this show to one of its biggest and most public rivals. South Park, created by Trey Parker and Matt Stone, has had an openly contentious relationship with Family Guy for decades. In 2006, South Park aired a 2-part episode called Cartoon Wars, which directly mocked Family Guy's writing process, depicting its jokes as being generated essentially at random, the comedic equivalent of throwing darts at a board. According to Parker, the reaction from elsewhere in the animation industry was telling. He has said that after those episodes aired, writers from both The Simpsons and King of the Hill reportedly reached out to thank the South Park team for putting into words what a lot of industry insiders were already quietly thinking about the show's reliance on disconnected gags. That criticism, fair or unfair, brings us naturally to one of the most defining features of Family Guy, the cutaway gag, and how it became both the show's signature and, for a lot of longtime fans, its biggest creative crutch. A cutaway works like this. A character references something, the screen jumps to a short, unrelated scene illustrating that reference, and then the show cuts back to where it left off as though nothing happened. This format was present from the very first episode, Death Has a Shadow, which aired that night after the Super Bowl back in January of 1999. In the early years, these cutaways were short, sharp, and specific. They functioned as a bonus, a little extra treat layered on top of episodes that already had complete stories with real beginnings, middles, and endings. You could, in theory, strip every single cutaway out of a Season 1 episode and still be left with a fully functional, genuinely funny piece of television. Over the years, as new writers rotated through the staff and the show settled into its long-term rhythm on Fox, the balance shifted. Cutaways grew longer, more frequent, and increasingly central to how episodes were constructed, to the point where critics began to argue that some later episodes might only contain 10 minutes of actual plot wrapped around a much larger volume of disconnected sketches. Whether you see that evolution as a creative downgrade or simply a different comedic philosophy is something fans still argue about constantly online, but there's no disputing that it represents one of the most significant structural changes the show has gone through across its run. Let's pause here again for a moment of quiet. If you've made it this far into the night with me, drop a comment and let me know your time zone, your city, wherever you happen to be curled up listening to this right now. It's genuinely one of my favorite parts of putting these together, watching the comments fill up with little dots scattered across a map of the world, all of us awake at different hours, listening to the same slow story unfold. And if this kind of deep, unhurried storytelling is something you enjoy, the subscribe button helps more than you'd think. Now, let's keep wandering through the history of this strange, enduring little show. One of the more revealing pieces of insight into how an episode actually gets written comes from longtime executive producer Steve Callahan, who has described the unusual performative quality of the Family Guy writers' room. According to Callahan, a large portion of the writing staff has a background in performance, whether stand-up, improv, or sketch comedy, and rather than simply reading jokes off a page during pitch meetings, Writers will frequently get up and physically act out a gag for the rest of the room, almost like a tiny audition. It's described as something close to a vaudeville act happening behind closed doors every single day, dozens of small performances thrown out into the room in hopes that one of them sticks and survives the editing process all the way to broadcast. There's also a wonderfully specific bit of trivia about an actor who almost became one of the most central voices on the entire show and never did. Seth MacFarlane has said publicly that the respected actor William H. Macy auditioned for the role of Brian Griffin back in 1997, before the show had even been picked up. MacFarlane has joked, with what sounds like genuine self-deprecating humor, that turning Macy down for the role might have been one of his worst calls. Though obviously the version of Brian that did end up on screen, voiced by MacFarlane himself, became one of the most recognizable characters in modern animation regardless. Now, let's talk about money for a moment, because the economics of keeping a show like this running for over 2 decades are genuinely fascinating and explain a lot about why the show has never simply ended despite years of declining live viewership. According to reporting on the production side of the show, the core cast members have, at various points, earned between roughly $175,000 and $225,000 per episode each. Multiply that across a full season, across multiple decades, across a cast of half a dozen principal voices, and you start to understand why animated shows of this scale represent such an enormous financial undertaking, even though, on paper, they're cheaper to produce than live-action programming. There are no sets to build, no wardrobe departments, no location permits. The expense is almost entirely tied up in writing, animation labor, and the voice cast, and that leaner cost structure is part of why a show can keep being renewed even as its first-run ratings shrink dramatically, something we'll dig into properly later tonight. Let's drift now into the world of controversy, because few shows in television history have generated as long and as varied a list of public complaints, lawsuits, and government pushback as Family Guy, and the details behind several of these moments are far stranger than most casual viewers realize. Start with the Parents Television Council, a conservative media watchdog organization that has targeted Family Guy almost since the very week it premiered. The PTC has named the show its Worst TV Show of the Week designation on more than 40 separate occasions since 2005 alone, and placed it on their formal list of Worst Primetime Shows for Family Viewing in 2000, 2005, and 2006. In May of 2000, the organization launched a coordinated letter-writing campaign specifically aimed at pressuring Fox into canceling the show entirely, years before the network's own scheduling decisions accomplished something close to that goal on their own. The Federal Communications Commission, the United States government body responsible for regulating broadcast content, received multiple formal petitions over the years, asking that the show be pulled off the air entirely on indecency grounds. Religion became a particularly consistent flashpoint. The PTC's own 2006 report on religious content in television, titled Faith in a Box, specifically singled out Family Guy, concluding that what they called mockery of God was, in their words, a constant presence on the show. One frequently cited example comes from an episode called The Courtship of Stewie's Father, which features a cutaway depicting God in a deeply irreverent light, while a teenage version of Jesus tries to get advice about a personal conflict with Joseph. A later episode, The 2,000-Year-Old Virgin, drew similar fire from the Media Research Center, another conservative watchdog group, for its portrayal of Jesus manipulating people into intimate situations. In something close to a wink at its own critics, that very episode has Peter directing people to file complaints with an organization called the Family Television Council, a thinly veiled, only slightly disguised stand-in for the real PTC. Legal battles have followed the show almost as consistently as moral outrage. In March of 2007, comedian and television legend Carol Burnett filed a $6 million lawsuit against 20th Century Fox, arguing that one of her signature characters, a cleaning woman she had performed for years on her own variety show, had been used on Family Guy without her permission, constituting both trademark infringement and a violation of her publicity rights. A federal judge rejected the lawsuit in June of that year, ruling that the parody was protected under the First Amendment, citing the landmark Hustler magazine versus Falwell case as precedent. Later that same year, in October of 2007, the Bourne Company, a music publishing house, filed a copyright infringement lawsuit over an episode called When You Wish Upon a Weinstein, which featured a parody song titled I Need a Jew, built on the melody of the classic Disney standard When You Wish Upon a Star. Bourne, which held the copyright to the original song, argued the parody simply borrowed their melody wholesale and paired it with lyrics they considered anti-Semitic, without offering any actual commentary on the original song itself, a legal distinction that matters quite a bit in parody law. The lawsuit named MacFarlane personally, along with 20th Century Fox, the Fox Broadcasting Company, Cartoon Network, and composer Walter Murphy. It took until March of 2009 for a federal judge to rule in the show's favor, finding that the parody had sufficiently transformed the original song for comedic purposes and did not constitute infringement. Perhaps the most internationally significant controversy involved a 2009 episode titled 420, which centered on a campaign to legalize marijuana in the show's fictional town. The episode caused a genuine diplomatic ripple when Venezuela's justice minister at the time, Tariq El-Aissami, publicly cited the episode as evidence of the United States promoting drug use, and the Venezuelan government threatened to fine any cable provider in the country that continued to air Family Guy. It's a strange thing to consider, an American animated sitcom generating an official government response on another continent, but it speaks to just how far this show's cultural reach had extended by that point in its run. One of the most emotionally charged controversies came in 2010, with an episode called Extra Large Medium. The episode featured a character with Down syndrome named Ellen, voiced by actress and public speaker Andrea Faye Friedman, who herself has Down syndrome. During the episode, Ellen casually mentions that her mother is a former governor of Alaska, a clear and deliberate reference to former vice presidential candidate Sarah Palin, whose youngest son has Down syndrome. Palin publicly criticized the episode in an appearance on television, calling the people behind it cruel and cold-hearted, while her daughter, Bristol, posted a statement on Palin's behalf calling the writers heartless. What made the controversy unusually complicated is that Friedman herself, the actress who voiced the joke, publicly pushed back against Palin rather than siding with her, stating in an interview that she felt the joke was aimed squarely at Sarah Palin rather than at her son, and that she personally did not appreciate being used, in her words, as a kind of political prop. MacFarlane later addressed the controversy directly, describing the show's comedic philosophy as being an equal opportunity offender, a defense he has returned to many times over the years whenever the show's content draws backlash from any particular group or political direction. Let's take a breath here. We've covered the founding of the show, the cancellations, the revival, the recording booth, and a long stretch of its most public controversies. If you're still here with me, still wrapped up wherever you're listening from, go ahead and drop your location and the time on your clock right now into the comments. I genuinely love watching that little map of the world build up underneath these videos. And of course, if you haven't yet, the subscribe button is sitting right there waiting. Let's keep going, because there is still a great deal of ground left to cover, including some of the strangest production decisions the show has ever made. Let's talk now about the writer's strike years, because they shaped the show's rhythm more than most fans realize. In November of 2007, the Writers Guild of America went on strike, a massive industry-wide work stoppage that lasted roughly 3 months, running until February of 2008. The strike was fought primarily over compensation for writers when their work was distributed digitally or sold on DVD, an issue that, in a strange bit of irony, connects directly back to the very mechanism that had saved Family Guy from cancellation just a few years earlier. MacFarlane was a vocal and visible supporter of the writers during the strike, joining picket lines personally rather than simply issuing a public statement of solidarity from a distance. During the disruption, Fox made the decision to air 3 already completed episodes of Family Guy without MacFarlane's blessing. Because those episodes had technically been finished before the strike began, the network was within its legal rights to broadcast them, but doing so against the explicit wishes of the show's creator created an early crack in what would become an increasingly strained relationship between MacFarlane and the network over the following decade and a half. That same dynamic resurfaced again during the 2023 Writers Guild strike. MacFarlane, along with the show's longtime showrunners and the showrunners of sibling series American Dad, made it clear to the production company that none of them intended to work on their respective shows while the strike remained active, a position that delayed production once again and pushed MacFarlane back onto a picket line for the second major strike of his career. By this point in the story, it's worth addressing something that genuinely surprised a lot of longtime viewers when it became public. In 2017, during an Ask Me Anything session on the social platform Reddit, MacFarlane revealed that he had not personally written for the show since 2010. Around that point, he shifted his role almost entirely toward production oversight and voice acting, stepping back from the day-to-day creative writing process that had defined the show's earliest, most personally guided seasons. The showrunning responsibilities passed largely to longtime collaborators Rich Appel and Alex Sulkin, who took over the daily management of story decisions, scripts, and overall direction, while MacFarlane focused his energy elsewhere. And there was certainly elsewhere for him to focus. The years following his step back from active writing duties were extraordinarily busy ones for MacFarlane as a creative figure in Hollywood more broadly. In 2012, he wrote, directed, produced, and starred in the live-action comedy Ted, the story of a man whose childhood teddy bear comes to life and remains his foul-mouthed best friend into adulthood. The film was a massive commercial success, eventually grossing more than $500 million worldwide and earning MacFarlane an Academy Award nomination for the original song featured in the film. He followed that with the 2014 Western comedy A Million Ways to Die in the West, which he again wrote, directed, and starred in, and then with the sequel Ted 2 in 2015. In 2017, he created and starred in a science fiction television series called The Orville, which began on Fox before eventually moving to the streaming service Hulu. He hosted the 85th Academy Awards ceremony in 2013. He served as an executive producer on the well-regarded science documentary series Cosmos, A Spacetime Odyssey, hosted by astrophysicist Neil deGrasse Tyson. He even built out a live-action prequel series connected to the TED universe for the streaming service Peacock, which launched in 2024. On top of all of that, MacFarlane has built a genuinely respected secondary career as a singer of traditional big band and jazz standards, releasing multiple albums and performing at venues as prestigious as Carnegie Hall and the Royal Albert Hall. There is a particularly candid moment from an interview MacFarlane gave to The Hollywood Reporter back in 2011 that a lot of longtime fans point to as a kind of turning point in understanding his evolving relationship with his own creation. In that interview, MacFarlane stated plainly that he believed 7 seasons was about the right natural lifespan for a television series, a comment that, when you consider Family Guy was already well past that mark at the time and has continued for well over a decade since, takes on a fairly striking meaning. It suggests that even by the early 2010s, the man whose name is most associated with this show had already, in some sense, mentally moved on from it as an ongoing creative passion project, even as it continued generating new episodes year after year. His relationship with Fox itself eventually became strained for reasons that had nothing to do with ratings or scheduling and everything to do with politics. MacFarlane is openly liberal and has been outspoken about his political views for years. Fox, the broadcast network airing his flagship show, shares a parent corporate lineage with Fox News, and MacFarlane became increasingly uncomfortable with that association as the years went on. In 2021, he posted publicly that commentary from a prominent Fox News host had made him wish Family Guy aired on virtually any other network, comparing the relationship between himself and Fox to a marriage that both sides quietly knew was no longer working. This was not a private grumble. This was the creator of one of the network's longest-running and most profitable shows, publicly stating, in effect, that he wanted out. That frustration eventually translated into a significant business decision. In 2020, MacFarlane signed a deal with NBC Universal, reportedly worth around $200 million over 5 years, moving his production company, Fuzzy Door Productions, into the Comcast media family and away from the Fox ecosystem for his newer projects. The Orville and the live-action Ted series were both built for platforms entirely separate from Fox, leaving Family Guy as essentially the last major thread still tying MacFarlane contractually to a network he had publicly expressed discomfort with. And yet, despite all of that, in April of 2024, MacFarlane gave an interview discussing the future of the show in terms that were notably more pragmatic than passionate. He explained that he didn't see a compelling reason to stop making it because audiences still enjoyed it. It continued making people happy, and the revenue it generated helped fund causes he personally cares about, including environmental conservation work through organizations like Rainforest Trust. He used a memorable phrase to describe the show's current state, saying it had reached what he called escape velocity, meaning it had been running for so long that there was simply no obvious logical reason to end it unless the audience itself eventually stopped caring entirely. It's a notably different tone from the bursting, 6 months without sleep energy of the 24-year-old animator, hand-drawing a 15-minute pilot in his kitchen back in 1998. The business side of the story took its most concrete recent shape in April of 2025, when it was announced that Family Guy had secured a major renewal deal with its current parent company, Disney, extending the series all the way through what would become its 27th season and the 2028 to 2029 broadcast year, timed to coincide with the show's 30th anniversary. Each season under this new agreement would consist of 15 episodes. Whatever your personal feelings about the show's current creative direction, that renewal makes one thing structurally clear. Family Guy is not ending anytime soon, and its continued existence is, at this point, driven far more by the economics of a long-running media franchise than by any singular creative vision pushing it forward. Let's slow down again for a moment before we move into the final stretch of tonight's story. Wherever you are right now, whatever room, whatever country, whatever hour it happens to be on your clock, take a second and drop it in the comments below. It genuinely means something to see this little scattered audience of night listeners checking in from all over the place. And if you've enjoyed settling into this story so far, go ahead and tap that subscribe button so the next one finds its way to you without you having to go looking for it. Now let's turn to the ratings themselves, because the numbers tell their own quiet, undeniable story about how dramatically the show's audience has shifted over a quarter century. That first episode back in January of 1999 pulled in around 22 million viewers, a figure inflated significantly by its post-Super Bowl placement. But the show's first full season still averaged a very respectable 12.8 million households, good enough for a rank of 33rd overall in the Nielsen ratings that year. After the show's revival in 2005, Season 4 averaged somewhere in the neighborhood of 11 to 12 million viewers on its premiere, a genuinely impressive number for a series that had been off the air for 3 full years. From that point forward, the trajectory has been a slow, steady decline, the kind that's easy to miss year over year but impossible to ignore when you zoom out across the full run. By the show's 20th season, average viewership had fallen to roughly 1.3 million viewers, with a key advertising demographic rating that had shrunk to a small fraction of what it once commanded. By season 23, that number had dropped even further, down to a few 100,000 viewers tuning in live for new episodes, a tiny fraction of the audience that once made this one of the most watched shows in America. The show's scheduling reflects that decline too. For most of its run, Family Guy occupied a prized Sunday night slot as part of Fox's so-called animation domination lineup, sharing the night with The Simpsons and other major animated comedies. In 2019, it was quietly bumped from its longtime 9 o'clock position to a slightly less prominent 9:30 slot. Then, for the 2023 to 2024 broadcast season, Fox made an even more significant move, pulling both Family Guy and fellow longtime animated series Bob's Burgers entirely off the Sunday animation block and shifting Family Guy to Wednesday nights, the first time in the show's history it had aired on a weekday since its original troubled run before the first cancellation back in 2002. In the television industry, a move like that is widely understood as a quiet signal that a network no longer considers a show one of its headline attractions. And yet, despite all of that decline in traditional live ratings, the financial logic underpinning the show's continued existence remains remarkably sound, which explains why it keeps getting renewed regardless of where its weekly numbers land. Animated programming is considerably cheaper to produce than live-action television, since there are no expensive sets, no large rotating casts of background actors, and no costly location shoots. The bulk of the production budget goes toward writing, animation labor often handled by overseas studios, and a relatively small principal voice cast. On top of that, Family Guy continues to generate substantial revenue well outside of its first-run broadcast, through syndicated reruns on networks like Adult Swim, Comedy Central, and FXX, through streaming licensing deals, and through a steady stream of merchandise sales that have continued for over 2 decades. As long as that broader ecosystem remains profitable, a show like this can continue indefinitely, almost entirely independent of how many people are actually watching new episodes live on a Wednesday night. It's worth pausing here to acknowledge the show's genuine critical and cultural achievements too, because for all the controversy and all the ratings decline, Family Guy did accomplish something historically rare. In 2009, the show received a nomination for the Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Comedy Series, a category that animated programs are almost never even considered for. The last time an animated series had received that specific nomination before Family Guy was The Flintstones, all the way back in 1961, nearly 50 years earlier. Not even The Simpsons, widely regarded as the most influential and acclaimed animated comedy in American television history, had managed that particular feat. In 2013, TV Guide ranked Family Guy as the 9th greatest television cartoon ever made. Across its run, the show has also won multiple Primetime Emmy Awards specifically for outstanding voiceover performance, recognizing MacFarlane's work as Stewie in particular, along with an additional Emmy for outstanding music and lyrics tied to the show's original songwriting. Let's shift gears now and talk about the show's relationship to its own sibling series, American Dad, because the story of how that show came to exist is tangled up directly with Family Guy's own near-death experience. American Dad premiered on February 6, 2005, just a few months ahead of Family Guy's own Season 4 return, and was co-created by MacFarlane alongside writers Mike Barker and Matt Weitzman. The show followed an intensely patriotic, somewhat unhinged CIA agent named Stan Smith, his family, an alien house guest named Roger who lives in their attic, and a German-accented goldfish named Klaus who happens to actually be a man whose brain was placed inside a fish's body by the CIA. For its first couple of seasons, American Dad leaned heavily into overt political satire and struggled somewhat to find a consistent comedic identity beyond Stan's exaggerated conservatism, and it was widely dismissed at the time as a lesser shadow of Family Guy, riding on its older siblings' coattails simply by virtue of sharing a time slot and a creator. Over time, that perception shifted dramatically, with critics and fans increasingly pointing to American Dad's character development and tighter storytelling as a kind of unfavorable mirror, held up against Family Guy's own later season choices, though that's a layered conversation that depends heavily on which specific seasons of each show you're comparing. American Dad also took a notably different path through the television landscape than its older sibling. After 11 seasons on Fox, the show transitioned to the cable network TBS, a move that gave its writing staff considerably more creative freedom regarding content standards, and the series continued production successfully from that new home for many additional seasons. It stands today as one of the longer-running animated series in American television history in its own right, a genuine creative sibling to Family Guy, rather than simply a footnote in its larger story. Let's pause once more here before we head toward the final stretch of tonight's journey through this show's history. If you're still with me, drop your location and your local time into the comments below, because I genuinely do read through them, and it's one of my favorite small rituals connected to making these. And if you've made it this far and you're enjoying the slow pace of this kind of storytelling, please do hit that subscribe button, because it helps far more than you might expect in keeping a small channel like this one growing. Let's talk now about the spin-off that often gets overlooked in conversations about the broader Family Guy universe, a show called The Cleveland Show. Cleveland Brown, originally a recurring neighbor and friend within the core Family Guy cast, was given his own series in 2009, relocating the character along with his new family to a fictional town called Stool Bend. The show ran for 4 seasons before being canceled in 2013, and Cleveland was subsequently brought back into the main Family Guy cast as a recurring character once again. It represents an interesting little experiment in the broader MacFarlane animated universe, a show that never quite achieved the cultural footprint of its parent series or its other sibling, American Dad, but it remains a meaningful part of the larger production history of this entire era of Fox animation. And it's a piece of trivia that even some longtime fans of the original show have genuinely forgotten ever existed in its own right. Let's also touch on something a little more technical, but genuinely fascinating if you've never thought about it before, which is exactly how an episode of Family Guy actually comes together from a script to a finished broadcast. The process typically begins with a writer or a small group of writers pitching a premise, often performed out loud for the rest of the room in that vaudeville-style pitch culture Steve Callahan has described publicly. Once a script is approved, storyboard artists translate the written scenes into a visual sequence, essentially a comic book-style draft of the entire episode, which serves as a guide for both the director and the animation team. While the animation itself is being produced, often by teams working overseas, the voice actors record their lines, frequently working together in the same studio session given how tightly interwoven many of the show's scenes are between characters. The entire process, from initial script approval to finished, fully animated, fully scored episode, can take many months, which is part of why long-running animated shows like this one are often working many episodes ahead of whatever is currently airing on any given week. There's a particularly sweet, almost meta moment from the show's own history worth mentioning here too, connected to an anniversary special. In 2019, an episode titled You Can't Handle the Booth aired, in which the principal cast, performed by MacFarlane himself alongside Alex Borstein, Seth Green, and Mila Kunis, broke the fourth wall directly, with the actors essentially appearing as themselves inside the recording booth to explain to the characters that none of them are real, that they're simply being voiced by a small handful of actors. It's a strange, self-aware little wink at the exact behind-the-scenes process we've just walked through together, the show acknowledging its own machinery directly to its audience after 2 full decades on the air. As we start to settle toward the end of tonight's story, it feels worth reflecting for a moment on just how unlikely this entire journey has been from the very start. A college thesis film made by a sleep-deprived art student became a sequel short broadcast on a kid's cartoon block, which became a 15-minute pilot animated entirely by one exhausted person in his own kitchen, which became a primetime network show that was canceled, brought back from the dead through an unprecedented wave of DVD sales and late-night cable reruns, canceled again in the public mind through years of declining ratings and demoted time slots, and somehow remains, even now, locked into a renewal deal that guarantees its survival well into its 30th anniversary year. Very few pieces of media history have a path quite this strange, this layered or this thoroughly documented in lawsuits, government complaints, and quiet little interviews scattered across a quarter-century of press tours. If you've stayed with me through this entire long, winding story tonight, thank you for letting this be part of your evening, your commute, your wind down before bed, or whatever quiet corner of your day you carved out to listen. Make sure you're subscribed if you want to be here for the next one of these slow, detailed deep dives. And if tonight's story was the kind of thing that helped you relax or drift off, leave a like on your way out so this channel knows to keep making more of them. Sleep well wherever you are. Let's drift now into a part of the show's history that almost nobody outside the animation industry ever thinks about, which is the actual physical labor of getting 22 minutes of moving pictures onto your television screen every single week for 25 years. Every animated show, no matter how big its budget or how famous its name, has to send its work somewhere to actually be drawn, colored, and assembled, frame by frame. And Family Guy's relationship with its various animation houses is its own quiet little story of evolution. In the very first season, the bulk of the animation work was handled by a Korean studio collaboration known as Grimsiam, working alongside Sunwoo Digital. If you go back and watch those original 15 episodes now, there's a particular roughness to the line work, a certain handmade quality to how the characters move, that fans and animation historians alike have come to associate specifically with that earliest era of the show. It isn't polished in the way later seasons would become, but there's an undeniable energy and character to it, the visual equivalent of a band's scrappy first album before the production budget grew. When the show returned for its second season, the workload was split between several different overseas partners, including a studio called Yesin and the American company Rough Draft Studios, which had been founded back in 1991 in a Van Nuys, California garage by a husband and wife team named Greg and Nikki Vanzo. Rough Draft's story is genuinely fascinating in its own right. Nikki Vanzo had been working as a contractor on the legendary, notoriously difficult production of the Ren and Stimpy show, and she approached that show's creator about the idea of moving animation work to South Korea to control costs and quality more effectively than some of the domestic options available at the time. Out of that conversation, she founded Rough Draft Korea, based in Seoul, which went on to become one of the most prolific overseas animation houses in the history of American television, eventually contributing to shows as varied as The Simpsons, SpongeBob SquarePants, Adventure Time, Gravity Falls, King of the Hill, and Phineas and Ferb, alongside its work on Family Guy. Rough Draft handled the bulk of Family Guy's animation from roughly Season 2 through Season 6, and many longtime fans consider this stretch to represent the show at its most visually fluid and expressive, with characters that stayed reliably on model and movement that felt lively rather than stiff. After Season 6, the workload shifted again, this time toward a studio called Digital Emation, which became the primary animation house for the back half of Season 6 and carried that responsibility for a significant stretch of the show's middle years, eventually becoming the dominant studio credited from around Season 9 onward. Other Korean studios rotated through the production pipeline as well over the years, including outfits called Yerim and Coco Enterprises, each contributing to different individual episodes depending entirely on scheduling and capacity in any given production cycle. If you ever wonder why certain stretches of episodes have a slightly different feel to the way Peter's face moves or the way a punch lands during a fight scene, the answer is very often simply which overseas studio happened to be handling that particular batch of episodes that month. This kind of overseas multi-studio production pipeline is extremely common in American television animation, far more common than most casual viewers realize, but it's rarely discussed openly. And it's exactly the sort of behind-the-curtain mechanism that makes a show like this feel less like a single unified artistic vision and more like an enormous, ongoing industrial collaboration between dozens of artists scattered across 2 continents, all working from the same scripts and storyboards to produce something that, for 22 minutes a week, looks and feels seamless to the audience at home. Before we keep going, let's take another one of our little pauses together. If you're still here, wherever you happen to be tonight, go ahead and drop your city and your local time down in the comments below. It's such a small thing, but it genuinely makes these late-night listens feel like less of a solitary thing and more like a shared one, even though none of us are actually in the same room. And if you've been enjoying this slow unwinding of the show's history, the subscribe button really does help more than you'd think for a channel like this one. Let's keep going. Now, let's talk about the sound of the show, because the music of Family Guy is one of its most underappreciated creative threads, and the story of how its iconic theme song came together is genuinely charming. The man behind it is a composer named Walter Murphy, a pianist and arranger who, decades before Family Guy existed, had an enormous mainstream hit of his own with a 1976 disco reinterpretation of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony called A Fifth of Beethoven, a song so popular during the height of the disco era that it actually appeared on the soundtrack of Saturday Night Fever. Murphy had studied jazz and classical piano at the Manhattan School of Music, spent time arranging music for Doc Severinsen and the Tonight Show Band, and built a career writing commercial jingles before MacFarlane brought him on board for this strange new animated pilot. According to Murphy's own account of their first meeting, MacFarlane didn't simply ask him to write generic theme music. He described in vivid, specific detail the entire visual sequence of the opening credits before a single frame had been animated, the husband and wife seated at a piano in a deliberate homage to the opening of the classic sitcom All in the Family, the rest of the characters filing in one by one to join the song, and then the back wall of the room flying away to reveal the whole family suddenly standing on a full Broadway-style stage in Tuxedo Tales. Murphy's first attempt was a fairly straightforward Broadway arrangement, which MacFarlane liked but asked him to push further, requesting something with more of a swing feel. Murphy took it home, reworked it, and came back with the big band swing arrangement that has now opened literally hundreds of episodes across 25 years. There's a wonderfully scrappy little detail buried in how that very first recording came together too. At the time, Fox had not even allocated a formal music budget for the still unproven show, so the original theme song recording was produced using essentially one trumpet player covering multiple parts, a single trombone player, one saxophonist, Murphy himself filling in on additional instruments, and a small handful of background singers brought in to round out the vocal arrangement. That scrappy, low-budget original recording is, astonishingly, still the exact recording used to open the show today, more than 2.5 decades later. Murphy and MacFarlane, along with writer David Zuckerman, even received an Annie Award nomination in 2000 specifically for the theme song's composition, a genuine honor within the animation industry. Murphy went on to score the vast majority of the show's individual episodes as well, frequently weaving the main theme melody back into his incidental music cues throughout an episode, a subtle technique that ties the entire score of any given episode back to that original swing arrangement in ways most casual viewers absorb subconsciously without ever quite noticing. He has continued working with MacFarlane across an enormous range of projects beyond Family Guy itself, scoring The Cleveland Show, American Dad, and both of MacFarlane's live-action TED films, building one of the longer-running composer-creator partnerships in modern television and film. There's a lovely little piece of trivia tucked into the lyrics of that theme song too, one that fans have picked apart for years. The closing line of the song, sung by Stewie, is the phrase "laugh and cry," but because of how quickly it's sung and how the syllables blend together, generations of viewers have sworn they're actually hearing a much more profane phrase. MacFarlane himself addressed this directly during an appearance on the show Inside the Actor's Studio, acknowledging that, taken literally, the intended lyric doesn't even make complete grammatical sense, which has only fueled the decades-long fan debate over what exactly Stewie is singing in that closing moment. Let's shift now to one of the single most talked-about creative decisions in the show's entire run, a moment that genuinely tested the loyalty and patience of its longtime audience in a way few other episodes ever have. We touched on it briefly earlier tonight, but the full story deserves a much closer look, because it tells you almost everything you need to know about where the show's priorities sat by its 12th season. In November of 2013, an episode called Life of Brian aired, the 6th episode of Season 12. The plot follows Brian and Stewie on one of their signature time travel road trip adventures, ultimately leading Stewie to make the difficult decision to permanently destroy his time machine in order to prevent any further damage to the timeline. Almost immediately after making that choice, in a moment of devastating dramatic irony, Brian is struck and killed by a passing car right outside the Griffin family's home. The episode plays the aftermath with an unusually heavy hand for a show built almost entirely on absurdist comedy, lingering on the family's genuine grief, building toward a tearful eulogy from Peter, and ultimately introducing a brand new family dog named Vinny, voiced by Sopranos actor Tony Sirico, who moves into the household in Brian's place. The reaction from the show's audience was immediate and enormous. A hashtag campaign calling for Brian's return spread rapidly across social media, and a petition started on the website change.org, calling for the character's resurrection, eventually gathered more than 100,000 signatures. MacFarlane has said publicly, in multiple separate interviews over the following years, that the size and intensity of the backlash genuinely surprised him and his writing team. He described it as a strange kind of validation, a sign that audiences still care deeply enough about a 22-minute cartoon character to be that emotionally invested in his fate, even after more than a decade on the air. Whatever the team's original intentions, the resolution came remarkably fast. Just 2 episodes later, in the December 2013 episode Christmas Guy, Stewie discovers a way to reconstruct his destroyed time machine using a piece recovered from a parallel timeline, travels back to the moment of the accident, and physically pushes Brian out of the car's path, erasing the entire arc and restoring him to life as though nothing had ever happened. MacFarlane addressed the abrupt reversal directly on social media shortly after the episode aired, writing with characteristic bluntness that he assumed nobody had genuinely believed the show would permanently kill off one of its most central characters. He has since stated in interviews that he believed the stunt ultimately helped the show's ratings during a stretch where the season 12 premiere had been down significantly compared to the prior year, framing the entire saga as a deliberate reminder to a long-running audience that the show could still surprise them after well over a decade on the air. Reaction to the entire arc has remained sharply divided among longtime viewers in the years since. Some critics, including the television outlet The AV, Club actually gave Life of Brian one of the highest individual episode grades of that entire season, praising the genuine emotional weight MacFarlane brought to Brian's final lines as a voice performance. Many longtime fans, however, have continued to describe the entire three-episode arc as a transparent and ultimately hollow ratings stunt, one that asked the audience to genuinely grieve a beloved character only to erase that grief entirely within a matter of weeks, undercutting whatever emotional investment the story had originally asked viewers to make. It remains, to this day, one of the most frequently cited examples whenever longtime fans discuss the show's willingness to manufacture short-term buzz at the expense of long-term storytelling consistency, and it stands as a genuinely fascinating case study in exactly how a multi-decade television franchise manages its own internal mythology when ratings, pressure, and creative instinct start pulling in different directions. Let's pause once more before we head into the final stretch of tonight's story. If you've made it this far, go ahead and drop your location and your local time into the comments, the way you have at each of our little check-ins tonight. And if this kind of patient, detailed storytelling is something you want more of, please do take a second to hit that subscribe button. It genuinely makes a difference for a channel like this one. Let's talk now about the sheer scale of the financial machine that Family Guy eventually became, because the numbers involved are almost difficult to comprehend for what began as a single exhausted art student animating a pilot in his own kitchen. As far back as 2008, industry estimates placed the franchise's total cumulative revenue at roughly $1 billion, broken down across multiple separate revenue streams, with approximately $400 million coming from television syndication deals, another $400 million from DVD sales, and roughly $200 million more from licensed merchandise alone. That merchandise empire has, over the years, grown to include an extraordinary range of products, from the expected t-shirts, mugs, and home goods to a Family Guy-branded pinball machine, multiple board game adaptations including a Family Guy edition of Trivial Pursuit, Monopoly, and Uno, and a long string of video games stretching back to the mid-2000s, including console titles simply called Family Guy Video Game, along with later mobile game entries like Family Guy, The Quest for Stuff, a free-to-play mobile title built around city-building mechanics that became remarkably successful in its own right within the broader mobile gaming market. The corporate ownership of the franchise itself underwent a massive structural shift in 2019, when the Walt Disney Company completed its acquisition of the bulk of 20th Century Fox's entertainment assets in a deal worth roughly $71 billion. As part of that enormous transaction, Disney came to own the underlying intellectual property rights to Family Guy itself, even though the show has continued to air its first-run episodes on the Fox broadcast network, which remained a separate, independent company after the Disney acquisition was completed. This created a genuinely unusual corporate arrangement, with Disney effectively licensing the show back to Fox for its weekly broadcast slot while retaining the deeper underlying ownership and streaming rights for itself. Family Guy itself eventually poked fun at this exact arrangement on screen, with one of the show's executive producers later telling reporters it took the writers' room only about 20 minutes of discussion to decide they wanted to make a joke about the acquisition once the deal became public. That Disney ownership has translated directly into the show's streaming presence. In the United States, every single season of Family Guy is available exclusively through Hulu, which Disney also owns a controlling stake in, with new episodes typically appearing on the platform the day immediately following their original Fox broadcast. Internationally, the show streams through the Star Content Hub within Disney Plus itself. The streaming performance numbers in recent years have been genuinely staggering. According to data released around the time of the show's most recent renewal announcement, Family Guy ranked among the top 10 most streamed television shows in the entire United States, with tens of billions of total minutes watched across a single year, a figure that dwarfs what its declining live broadcast ratings alone would ever suggest about the show's actual cultural reach. In late 2024, Hulu even debuted brand new Family Guy holiday specials exclusively on the streaming platform, marking the first time in the show's entire history that new episodes premiered on a streaming service before ever touching a traditional broadcast signal. a genuinely significant milestone in the show's slow transition from a strictly broadcast television institution into something closer to a streaming-first media property. The April 2025 renewal deal between Fox and Disney's 20th Television Animation Division, sometimes referred to informally within the industry as a mega deal, locked in 4 additional seasons each for Family Guy, The Simpsons, and Bob's Burgers, alongside a fresh commitment to bring MacFarlane's other long-running creation, American Dad, back to the Fox broadcast network itself after a decade of airing exclusively on the cable network TBS. Under that agreement, Family Guy is now locked in through its 27th season, running all the way to the 2028 to 2029 broadcast year, which will coincide directly with the 30th anniversary of that very first episode airing after the Super Bowl back in January of 1999. Whatever the show's live broadcast ratings continue to look like in the years ahead, its underlying economic engine, built on syndication, streaming, and merchandising revenue accumulated across a quarter century, appears to be more than sturdy enough to carry it comfortably into that 30th anniversary and likely well beyond it. Let's take one more pause here together before we move into the closing portion of tonight's story. If you're still curled up listening, drop your location and the time on your clock into the comments below one more time. And if you've enjoyed settling into this long, unhurried walk through the show's history, the subscribe button is right there whenever you're ready for it. Let's spend a little time now on the broader universe MacFarlane built around the core show itself, because Family Guy was never quite as isolated a creative property as it might appear from the outside. We've already talked about American Dad, which premiered alongside the show's 4th season revival in 2005 and eventually grew into a genuinely separate creative identity of its own. But there's also The Cleveland Show, which launched in the fall of 2009, spinning off the recurring neighbor character Cleveland Brown into his own series set in a fictional town called Stool Bend, alongside an entirely new family built around him. The show ran for 4 complete seasons before being canceled by Fox in 2013, at which point Cleveland was folded directly back into the main cast of Family Guy, returning to his original role as one of Peter's regular barroom companions. It represents an interesting little experiment in trying to extend the franchise even further, and while it never achieved anywhere close to the cultural footprint of either of its sibling shows, it remains a genuine and often overlooked piece of the larger MacFarlane animated television universe from that era. There's also a direct-to-DVD feature released back in 2005 called Family Guy Presents Stewie Griffin, The Untold Story, which arrived not long after the show's revival and offered an extended, rated, theatrical-style story built around Stewie's ongoing search for his biological father, exploring his character in a longer narrative format than a standard episode could typically accommodate. And the show has periodically engaged in genuine crossover events with other animated properties as well, most notably an episode called The Simpsons Guy, which aired during season 13 and brought the Griffin family into direct contact with Homer, Marge, Bart, Lisa, and the rest of the Simpsons cast, a genuinely significant moment in television history given the well-documented, decades-long rivalry and mutual ribbing between the two shows and their respective creative teams. As we start winding down toward the close of tonight's story, it's worth sitting for just a moment with how strange and improbable the entire arc of this show has been from beginning to end. A college thesis film submitted almost as an afterthought by a professor who simply thought it was good. A sequel short broadcast quietly on a cable cartoon block most viewers have long since forgotten existed. A 15-minute pilot animated entirely alone, by hand, in a kitchen, on a budget that wouldn't cover a single day of a typical animated production today. A massive opening night audience inherited almost entirely from a football game. 2 separate cancellations, either of which would have permanently ended almost any other show in television history. A genuinely unprecedented revival fueled not by critics or network executives, but by ordinary people buying DVDs and staying up late to catch reruns on a cable block built for insomniacs. A creator who eventually built an entire secondary career in film, television, music, and even astronomy documentaries, while quietly stepping back from the writer's room of the very show that made his name a household word. A corporate ownership structure so tangled that the company actually airing new episodes each week is legally separate from the company that owns the underlying rights to the characters themselves. And through every single twist of that journey. A fictional family living in a fictional Rhode Island town that has, somehow, against every reasonable expectation, remained on the air in some form for more than a quarter century. If you've stayed with me through this entire long, winding story tonight, thank you for letting it keep you company. Make sure you're subscribed if you'd like to be here for the next one of these slow, detailed deep dives. And if tonight helped you unwind or drift off, leave a like on your way out so the channel knows to keep making more of them. Sleep well, wherever you are. Let's slow down again together for a moment before we step into one of the most ambitious storytelling experiments the show ever attempted. Wherever you're tucked in tonight, whatever room or city or quiet stretch of highway you're listening from, drop your location and your local time into the comments whenever you get the chance. And if this kind of unhurried, detail-rich storytelling is something you find yourself drawn to, the subscribe button is sitting right there waiting for you. Now, let's talk about the night the show finally let Stewie do the one thing he had been threatening to do since the very first episode. By the time Family Guy reached its 100th episode, back in November of 2007, the writers decided to mark the milestone with something genuinely audacious. For close to a decade, Stewie's defining character trait, the joke that had introduced him to the world, was his open, unwavering desire to murder his own mother. Episode after episode had teased that ambition without ever letting him follow through, which is exactly the kind of long, simmering setup that makes for a satisfying payoff if a show is brave enough to actually deliver it. Before the episode aired, MacFarlane publicly teased that the 100th episode would feature the death of a major character, and the rumor mill around the show went into overdrive trying to guess who it might be. The answer arrived in a two-part story called Stewie Kills Lois and Lois Kills Stewie, which aired back-to-back on November 4th and November 11th of 2007. In the first half, Lois receives a pair of cruise tickets as a gift from Brian and decides to take Peter along, leaving Stewie behind and furious about being excluded from the trip. Seething with resentment, Stewie finally acts on his lifelong ambition, and by the end of the first part, Lois appears to have been shot and killed while out on the open water, with Peter eventually framed for her apparent murder and put on trial roughly a year later. The second half of the story flips the entire premise on its head. Lois, it turns out, survived the attack, was rescued from the ocean, suffered a period of amnesia, and spent months wandering the country, including an extended and genuinely strange detour working as a counselor at a weight loss camp before regaining her memory and returning home to expose Stewie publicly as her attacker. From there, the story escalates into something closer to an action thriller than a sitcom, with Stewie fleeing to Washington, D.C., with Brian in tow, ultimately seizing control of a weather manipulation device and briefly achieving the exact goal he had spent the entire series chasing, full-scale world domination, before Lois and Peter managed to track him down for a final, genuinely tense confrontation. There's a wonderful little piece of trivia buried in how that confrontation was staged and scored. The cliffhanger ending of the first episode, with Lois dramatically revealing Stewie as her attacker, was built as a direct, loving homage to a famous two-part Star Trek, The Next Generation cliffhanger called The Best of Both Worlds, right down to a matching musical sting and matching on-screen to-be-continued title cards. MacFarlane and the episode's writer, David A. Goodman, are both self-described devoted fans of that franchise, and they had apparently told each other for years that if the show ever reached its 100th episode, they wanted to pay tribute to that exact piece of Star Trek history. They originally hoped to simply license the actual cliffhanger music from that Star Trek episode, but the rights holder, Paramount, declined to grant permission. Rather than abandon the idea, the production turned to composer Ron Jones, who happened to be the very same composer who had originally written that famous piece of Star Trek cliffhanger music years earlier, and brought him on to compose an entirely new, original piece of music in that same dramatic style specifically for the Family Guy tribute. The episode ultimately pulled in genuinely massive numbers for the era, with reported live viewership above 10 million for the first installment, a figure that speaks to just how successfully the anniversary hype around the storyline had captured the audience's attention. Critics were largely impressed too. The entertainment outlet IGN rated the second half of the story particularly highly, praising its ability to balance genuine narrative tension with the show's established sense of absurdist comedy, while noting standout sequences involving a tense courtroom drama, a surprisingly elaborate musical number, and one of the show's most beloved recurring sight gags, the Kool-Aid Man bursting unexpectedly through a wall at the worst possible moment. But the story's final twist is what makes it genuinely fascinating to revisit today, especially when you consider how the show would go on to handle a strikingly similar storytelling decision years later with Brian's death. At the very end of the second episode, the entire dramatic year-long saga is revealed to have been nothing more than a computer simulation that Stewie was running inside his own laboratory, a kind of imagined dry run to test out exactly how a real attempt at matricide and world domination might actually unfold. Brian walks in on Stewie just as the simulation ends, and Stewie quietly admits that, having now seen how badly the consequences play out even in a simulated version of events, he isn't quite ready to actually go through with killing Lois or conquering the world after all. At least not yet. It's a clever twist, and at the time, most fans and critics treated it as a satisfying way to give the show's oldest and most central running joke a genuine sense of closure, without permanently altering the show's established status quo. Looking back at it now, though, it also reads as an early example of exactly the storytelling pattern that critics would eventually come to find frustrating about the show: a willingness to tease enormous, irreversible consequences for its characters, and then quietly reset everything back to normal before the credits roll. A pattern that would repeat itself in a much more emotionally charged way when the show killed and then almost immediately resurrected Brian several years later. There's one more small but genuinely lovely piece of trivia buried in this particular storyline that's worth mentioning before we move on. The episode features a deleted musical number, cut from the broadcast version for time but later restored on the show's DVD release, in which Stewie performs a parody of a song called As Someday It May Happen, originally from the classic Gilbert and Sullivan operetta The Mikado. It's exactly the kind of obscure theater nerd reference that speaks to the depth of musical and pop culture knowledge baked into the show's writer's room, the sort of detail that most casual viewers would never catch on a first watch, but that rewards longtime fans who go digging back through deleted scenes and old DVD extras years later. Let's pause one more time here together. If you've stayed with me through this part of the story, take a second and drop your location and your local time into the comments, the way you have throughout tonight. And if you've enjoyed this kind of slow, patient storytelling, please do hit that subscribe button before we move into our next section. Now, let's talk about one of the strangest and most beloved creative detours the show has ever taken. A moment where Family Guy essentially set its own ongoing storylines aside entirely to spend 3 separate hour-long specials lovingly recreating one of the most famous film trilogies ever made. The story behind how Family Guy ended up parodying the original Star Wars trilogy in its entirety begins, somewhat unexpectedly, with a legal conversation. According to MacFarlane's own retelling of the events during the show's 200th episode retrospective, the writers had been peppering individual episodes with small Star Wars references and jokes for years, casual nods that any pop culture-obsessed show of that era would naturally include. Eventually, those references became frequent enough that Fox's own legal department flagged the pattern as a genuine liability risk, warning the production that if they kept leaning on Star Wars material that heavily without formal permission, a lawsuit from Lucasfilm felt almost inevitable. MacFarlane and his team braced themselves for the worst, fully expecting to simply have to scale the references back going forward. Instead, when Fox's legal team formally reached out to Lucasfilm to ask for clearance, the response was a surprise in the opposite direction entirely. Lucasfilm, rather than shutting the references down, expressed genuine enthusiasm for the idea and gave the production their blessing. With that unexpected green light in hand, MacFarlane and his team decided to go far bigger than a handful of background jokes. Over the course of 3 separate seasons, the show produced 3 individual hour-long television specials, each one a scene-for-scene retelling of one of the 3 original Star Wars films, using the Family Guy cast slotted into the iconic roles. The first, titled Blue Harvest, a deliberate reference to the fake working title George Lucas originally used to disguise the production of Return of the Jedi from the press decades earlier, aired during Season 6 and retold the story of the original 1977 film, with Peter Griffin stepping into Han Solo's boots, Chris Griffin playing Luke Skywalker, Stewie cast as the towering, asthmatic villain Darth Vader, and Lois taking on the role of Princess Leia. The second special, titled Something 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 Dark Side, arrived during Season 8 and tackled The Empire Strikes Back, while the third and final installment, titled It's a Trap, aired during Season 9 and closed out the trilogy with a retelling of Return of the Jedi, this time pulling in supporting characters from across MacFarlane's entire animated universe, including figures from American Dad and The Cleveland Show, to fill out some of the trilogy's more minor roles. These specials genuinely captured the attention of pop culture at large in a way relatively few individual television episodes managed to achieve. According to reporting on the production, the cast and creative team behind the specials were invited to Lucasfilm's famous Skywalker Ranch facility as part of the collaborative clearance process, and George Lucas himself was reported to have personally watched and enjoyed the finished specials. There's also a wonderfully self-aware little detail buried in the opening text crawl of the third special, It's a Trap, which playfully acknowledges in character that the production team was beginning to feel a little exhausted by the format after 3 consecutive years of doing it, a meta joke that, according to the show's own DVD commentary, was rooted in genuine sincerity rather than pure fiction. The specials are also packed with small celebrity cameos and clever bits of stunt casting that longtime fans still delight in pointing out. Conservative radio host Rush Limbaugh appears as himself in a parody sequence within the first special, performing a version of his real radio show reimagined as though it were broadcasting from within the Star Wars universe. The beloved Sesame Street character Cookie Monster makes a memorable cameo as the fearsome ice creature known as the Wampa in the second special. And the third special leans into the ongoing, good-natured rivalry between Family Guy and Robot Chicken, another adult animated sketch show that also frequently parodies Star Wars, created in part by Family Guy's own Chris Griffin voice actor, Seth Green. In one sequence, the show's villain needles the Luke Skywalker stand-in by mocking Green's career and referencing Robot Chicken directly, leading into a small, playful argument among the Griffin family about which of the two Seths involved in the production, MacFarlane or Green, is ultimately the funnier and more talented of the pair. Let's pause here once more before we head toward the closing stretch of tonight's story. Drop your location and your local time into the comments if you haven't already, and make sure that subscribe button is tapped if you've been enjoying the slow unfolding of all of this tonight. Now, let's spend a little time on the show's awards history and its broader cultural footprint, because for all the controversy and all the criticism we've discussed tonight, Family Guy has also accumulated a genuinely remarkable trophy case over its 25 years on the air. Across its full run, the show has earned more than 24 Primetime Emmy Award nominations, eventually translating into multiple actual wins, most notably in the categories of Outstanding Voiceover Performance, recognizing MacFarlane's vocal work as Stewie on several separate occasions across different years, alongside an additional win for outstanding music and lyrics tied to original songwriting featured within specific episodes. As we discussed earlier tonight, the show's 2009 nomination for Outstanding Comedy Series remains one of its single most historically significant achievements, representing the first time an animated program had been nominated in that specific category since The Flintstones, nearly 5 decades earlier, and notably an honor that even The Simpsons, despite its own decades of acclaim, had never managed to receive. The show has also picked up nominations and wins from the Annie Awards, an industry honor specifically dedicated to excellence in animation, recognizing both the show's writing and its underlying musical composition, including that very first nomination for the theme song itself back in 2000. The show's cultural footprint extends well beyond formal industry trophies, too. A 2016 study conducted by the New York Times, analyzing the 50 television shows with the largest Facebook followings at the time, found that Family Guy's audience skewed heavily urban, a pattern shared by several other politically and culturally satirical comedies of that same era. The same research noted a measurable correlation between the show's fan base and broader political leanings within that audience, An interesting little data point that speaks to how thoroughly a long-running animated comedy can become woven into the broader cultural and even political identity of its most devoted viewers over enough years on the air. As we settle in toward the final stretch of tonight's journey through this strange, sprawling history, it's worth sitting with just how many separate, almost entirely unrelated threads we've followed tonight to get here. A college thesis film, a pilot drawn alone in a kitchen, two separate cancellations, an unprecedented DVD-fueled revival. A recording booth where four distinct voices all live inside one exhausted man's throat. A composer scrambling together a swing band theme song with a single trumpet player covering multiple parts because there wasn't yet a music budget to speak of. A Star Trek-loving writer finally getting to pay tribute to his favorite cliffhanger. A trilogy of Star Wars specials born out of a legal threat that somehow turned into a blessing. A creator who quietly stepped back from the writer's room while his name remained on every single episode. A corporate ownership structure so tangled that the network broadcasting the show and the company that actually owns it are now two entirely separate businesses. And, through every single one of those threads, a fictional family that has somehow managed to remain culturally relevant, commercially successful, and stubbornly, persistently on the air for more than a quarter of a century. If you've made it all the way here with me tonight, through every twist and every quiet little detour, thank you for letting this be part of your evening. Make sure you're subscribed if you'd like to be here for the next one of these long, unhurried deep dives, and if tonight's story helped you settle in or drift off, leave a like on your way out so the channel knows to keep making more of them. Sleep well, wherever you are tonight. Let's settle in for one more stretch tonight, because there's a particular episode in the show's history that holds a strange distinction even among everything we've already discussed. An episode that, to this day, has still never officially aired on American broadcast television at all. Before we get into it, take a moment wherever you are to drop your location and your local time into the comments. And if you haven't already, go ahead and tap that subscribe button. Now, let's talk about the episode Fox simply refused to put on the air. Back in 2009, at that year's San Diego Comic-Con, MacFarlane and his team first announced an upcoming episode of the show built entirely around the subject of abortion, a story eventually titled Partial Terms of Endearment. The plot follows Lois agreeing to act as a surrogate mother for an old college friend after the friend struggles with fertility issues, only for the intended biological parents to be killed in a car accident partway through the pregnancy, leaving Lois to grapple with an agonizing decision about what to do next. The episode was written by longtime staff writer Danny Smith and directed by Joseph Lee, and according to MacFarlane's own public comments at the time, the production fully expected the episode to eventually air on Fox without much issue, pointing to an earlier controversial episode, the one involving the parody song called I Need a Jew that we discussed earlier tonight, which had also initially been held back before eventually making it to broadcast a year or so later. This time, though, the outcome was different. Fox ultimately declined to ever air the episode domestically, and even Cartoon Network's Adult Swim block, which had a long history of airing edgier, previously withheld Family Guy content, declined Fox's request to broadcast it as well. The episode did eventually find an audience, just not in the United States first. It had its actual world television premiere on the British network BBC Three in June of 2010, drawing just under 1 million viewers in that initial UK broadcast, and was later released domestically on a standalone DVD in the United States that September, packaged alongside a separate primetime comedy special. To this day, Partial Terms of Endearment remains the only episode in the entire history of the show that has never been broadcast on any American cable or network television outlet, has never appeared in any syndication package, and is notably absent from both Hulu and Disney+, even though those two streaming services otherwise host the complete, uncut run of every other episode the show has ever produced. Critics who did eventually see the episode, largely through that British broadcast or the later DVD release, offered a genuinely mixed assessment, with some specifically praising the writers for, in their words, refusing to take the easy way out and actually committing to a clear resolution on a topic most television comedies would have avoided entirely, while others felt the episode leaned too heavily into shock value without quite landing the laughs it was reaching for. It's worth pointing out that this wasn't actually the first time Fox had quietly withheld a finished Family Guy episode from its original intended broadcast slot. Years earlier, back during the show's third season, an episode called When You Wish Upon a Weinstein, the same episode that later became the subject of that Bourne Company copyright lawsuit we discussed earlier tonight, was also pulled from its planned broadcast over concerns that some of its content could be read as anti-Semitic. That particular episode eventually did make it to air, first surfacing on Adult Swim in 2003 before finally getting a proper Fox broadcast in December of 2004, but the pattern is the same one we keep encountering throughout the show's history. A genuinely long-running mainstream network series, constantly testing exactly how far it can push its content, occasionally finding the line that even its own network isn't willing to cross. Let's pause here once more, the way we have throughout tonight. If you're still with me, drop your location and the time on your clock into the comments below, and make sure that subscribe button is tapped if this kind of patient, detailed storytelling has been the right kind of company for your evening. Now, let's spend some time on the enormous cast of recurring side characters and the small army of celebrities who have lent their voices to this show over the years, because that list is genuinely one of the more surprising threads in the entire Family Guy story. One of the most beloved recurring figures in the show's history was the character of Mayor Adam West, the wonderfully unhinged, frequently incoherent mayor of the Griffins' hometown, voiced for the entirety of his run by the actual real-life actor Adam West, best known to generations of television viewers for his iconic portrayal of Batman in the campy 1960s live-action series of the same name. West leaned fully into a heightened, self-parodying version of his own public persona for the role, playing a mayor whose decisions ranged from mildly eccentric to outright disturbing, all delivered with West's distinctively dry, deadpan vocal delivery. He continued voicing the character for the show until his death in 2017, at which point the role was not recast, and the character has remained, in the show's internal continuity, deceased ever since, a fairly rare example of Family Guy allowing a character's real-world circumstances to directly and permanently shape the fictional world of the show itself. The list of celebrities who have appeared on the show in some form, whether voicing themselves, voicing entirely original characters, or simply being referenced and parodied within a given episode, is genuinely staggering when you start to actually total it up. Patrick Stewart, best known to many audiences for his roles in Star Trek, The Next Generation, and the X-Men film franchise, has made recurring appearances on the show over the years, including voicing the recurring character Principal Shepard for a stretch, alongside his guest appearances tied to that 100th episode milestone story we discussed earlier tonight. James Woods appeared as an exaggerated parody version of himself across several episodes, with the show even naming the fictional local high school after him as a running gag. Carrie Fisher lent her voice to a brief cameo during the Star Wars trilogy of specials, playing a role connected to the Rebel Alliance leadership in a nod to her own famous role as Princess Leia in the actual films. Even American Idol judges Simon Cowell, Randy Jackson, and Paula Abdul made a joint cameo appearance during that 100th episode storyline, voicing themselves in a brief cutaway gag built around Stewie auditioning for the competition show. Stewie's voice itself carries its own small piece of trivia worth knowing. MacFarlane has cited the British actor Rex Harrison, most widely remembered for his role as Professor Henry Higgins in the classic film adaptation of My Fair Lady, as a direct inspiration for Stewie's particular brand of clipped, aristocratic, faintly menacing vocal delivery. It's a small detail, but once you know it, it's almost impossible not to hear that specific old Hollywood theatrical cadence every time Stewie opens his mouth. The show's longtime recurring cast of background and supporting voice actors deserves a mention here too, because several of them have been with the production for nearly the entirety of its run. Patrick Warburton, recognizable to many audiences from his earlier role as Putty on Seinfeld, has voiced the character of Joe Swanson, the Griffin's wheelchair-using neighbor and police officer, since the very first season. Mike Henry, a longtime member of the show's actual writing staff, voices both Cleveland Brown and the family's frequently disguised, sexually adventurous neighbor Glenn Quagmire. That overlap, where a member of the writer's room also serves as a primary voice actor, speaks to just how tightly woven the creative and performance sides of this production have remained across more than 2 decades, even as the writer's room itself has rotated through dozens of different individual contributors over the years. Let's take one more pause together before we head into the closing portion of tonight's story. If you've stayed with me this far, Drop your location and your local time into the comments one more time. And if you've genuinely enjoyed settling into this long, unhurried walk through the show's history tonight, please do hit that subscribe button before you go. There's a little more ground to cover yet. Let's talk now, in a bit more depth, about the sheer scale and persistence of the organized criticism this show has weathered across its entire run. Because it's genuinely one of the most sustained campaigns of organized public pushback any single television series has ever faced in American broadcast history. We touched on the Parents Television Council earlier tonight, but the full scope of that ongoing relationship is worth sitting with a little longer. According to the organization's own public records, Family Guy has been named their official Worst TV Show of the Week designation on more than 40 separate occasions dating back to 2005 alone, a frequency that suggests something closer to an ongoing institutional rivalry than a series of isolated complaints. The organization's specific objections have ranged enormously over the years, touching on the show's treatment of religious figures and themes, its handling of sexual content, its frequent and graphic depictions of violence, and its willingness to build entire storylines around subjects like terminal illness, disability, and reproductive health that most primetime comedies simply avoid touching at all. What makes this particular ongoing conflict so interesting, though, is how openly the show itself has chosen to engage with its own critics rather than simply ignoring them. We mentioned earlier that one 2014 episode actually included a thinly disguised parody organization called the Family Television Council as a direct in-show stand-in for the Real Parents Television Council, with Peter directing a fictional disgruntled viewer to file a complaint with that exact parody group. It's a small moment, but it captures something genuinely characteristic about how this show has operated across its entire run, absorbing criticism not by softening its content in response, but by folding that very criticism directly back into its own comedic material, turning its harshest real-world critics into recurring fictional punchlines within the show itself. The Federal Communications Commission angle adds another layer to this same ongoing story. Because Family Guy airs on a broadcast network rather than a subscription cable channel, it falls under a different and generally stricter set of federal content regulations than competitors like South Park, which has always aired on the subscription cable network Comedy Central. That distinction has meant the show has had to navigate broadcast standards and practices departments at Fox far more carefully than some of its closest creative competitors, even while still managing, across 25 years, to push an enormous amount of genuinely envelope-pushing content through that same regulatory filter. The multiple FCC petitions filed against the show over the years, while none of them ultimately succeeded in getting it pulled from the air, represent a genuinely unusual level of formal governmental attention directed at a single animated comedy, a level of scrutiny that very few other television programs in American history, animated or otherwise, have ever attracted with this much persistence and regularity. As we move toward the true close of tonight's story, it's worth reflecting for a moment on what all of this sustained controversy actually tells us about the show's broader place in American culture. A program that draws this much organized, formal, sustained criticism across more than 2 decades, from religious watchdog groups, from federal regulators, from foreign governments, from individual lawsuits filed by entertainers as beloved as Carol Burnett, is, almost by definition, a program that has remained culturally relevant and culturally visible for an extraordinarily long time. Shows that fade quietly into irrelevance do not continue attracting fresh waves of organized opposition decade after decade. Whatever your own personal opinion of the show's content or its particular brand of humor, the sheer persistence of that opposition is itself a kind of strange, backhanded testament to just how thoroughly Family Guy embedded itself into the broader fabric of American television culture across its first quarter-century on the air. If you've made it through this entire, long, winding story with me tonight, thank you, sincerely, for letting it be a part of your evening. From a college dorm room in Rhode Island to a kitchen table pilot animated by one exhausted 20-something, from 2 separate cancellations to an unprecedented DVD-fueled resurrection, from a recording booth where one man's voice carries 4 separate characters to a corporate ownership structure spanning 2 entirely different media conglomerates, this has been one of the strangest, most improbable, most thoroughly documented journeys in modern television history. Make sure you're subscribed if you'd like to be here for the next one of these slow, detailed deep dives. And if tonight's story helped you unwind or drift off into sleep, leave a like on your way out so the channel knows to keep making more of them. Rest well, wherever you are tonight. Let's settle into one more thread of this story before we begin truly winding things down for the night, because there's a whole separate career hiding inside Seth MacFarlane that most casual Family Guy viewers never think to look for, and it deserves a little time of its own. Take a moment, if you haven't already tonight, to drop your location and your local time into the comments. And if you've been enjoying this slow walk through the show's history, go ahead and tap that subscribe button before we keep going. Long before any of the controversy, long before the cancellations and the DVD-fueled resurrection, MacFarlane was, by his own account, just as drawn to music as he was to drawing cartoons. He has spoken in interviews about growing up making frequent family trips from his home in Connecticut up to Boston, where relatives lived, and where he first fell in love with the sound of a full orchestra by watching performances of the Boston Pops at Symphony Hall as a child. His parents enrolled him in musical theater productions from a young age, something he has described as simply being treated as a normal, healthy part of childhood in his household, alongside the drawing and animation that would eventually define his professional career. That early exposure left a lasting mark. By the time he was finishing high school, MacFarlane had actually been accepted into the graduate musical theater program at the Boston Conservatory of Music, a genuinely serious credential for a singer, and one that suggests his eventual pivot toward animation in Los Angeles was far from an inevitable, foregone path. He chose Rhode Island School of Design and a career in cartooning instead, but the music never really left him. That musical thread resurfaced almost immediately once Family Guy became established, starting with the show's very own soundtrack release. In 2005, MacFarlane served as a producer on an album called Family Guy, Live in Vegas, a Broadway-inspired collection built around the show's characters and musical numbers, which went on to earn a Grammy Award nomination of its own in the category of Best Comedy Album. That early nomination seems to have planted a seed, because several years later, in 2010, MacFarlane signed an actual recording contract with Universal Republic Records as a solo vocalist, entirely separate from any of his animated work, and released his debut studio album the following year under the title Music is Better Than Words. The album leaned heavily into classic American standards from what's often called the Great American Songbook, performed in a lush, full orchestra style directly modeled on his lifelong idol, Frank Sinatra. MacFarlane has explained in interviews that part of what draws him to that particular era and style of music is the sheer scale of the arrangements, the specific kind of orchestral writing that, in his words, sounds almost like a film score built specifically around a singer's lyrics, a style of large ensemble popular music he feels has become something close to a lost art in the modern recording industry. That debut album was recorded, fittingly, in the same legendary recording spaces Sinatra himself had once used, and it performed well enough commercially to climb to the top of the iTunes Jazz chart and earn MacFarlane his first Grammy nomination as a solo performer, specifically in the category of Best Traditional Pop Vocal Album. He didn't stop there. In 2014, he released his first holiday-themed record, Holiday for Swing, which charted even higher on the Billboard 200 than his debut had. The following year brought No One Ever Tells You, recorded once again at the historic Abbey Road Studios in London, which earned him yet another Grammy nomination. He followed that with In Full Swing in 2017, which picked up 2 more Grammy nods of its own, and then Once in a While in 2019, a more reflective, melancholy collection exploring themes of longing and lost love. During the isolation of the COVID-19 pandemic, MacFarlane collaborated remotely with singer and actress Elizabeth Gillies on a series of recordings, eventually expanding that partnership into a full holiday album together in 2023 called We Wish You the Merriest. His most recent release, from the summer of 2025, carries a particularly poignant title, Lush Life, The Lost Sinatra Arrangements, built around a collection of orchestral charts that had originally been written for Frank Sinatra himself decades earlier, by legendary arrangers Nelson Riddle, Billy May, and Don Costa, but had never actually been recorded or performed before MacFarlane discovered them buried within Sinatra's own personal archive of musical material and brought them to life for the very first time. Across this entire parallel career, MacFarlane has performed live with an extraordinary roster of major orchestras and venues, including the BBC Proms in London, the National Symphony Orchestra, the Boston Pops, the Los Angeles and New York Philharmonics, and the Chicago Symphony, among many others. He has shared a stage and a duet with Barbra Streisand, performed alongside legendary film composer John Williams at the Hollywood Bowl, and was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Original Song for a track he co-wrote alongside longtime Family Guy composer Walter Murphy for his own film Ted. By his own telling, the awards themselves were never really the primary motivation behind any of this. He has described his musical ambitions as being driven far more by a genuine desire to help keep an entire style of large ensemble American popular music alive and audible for new listeners than by any particular hunger for industry recognition, even as that recognition has followed him fairly consistently across 9 separate studio albums and multiple Grammy nominations. There's a particularly remarkable fact buried in MacFarlane's broader career timeline that's easy to lose track of amid everything else, which is just how young he actually was when all of this began. According to the Television Academy's own biographical materials, MacFarlane became the youngest showrunner in the history of American television at the age of just 24, when Family Guy first premiered on Fox in January of 1999. Think about everything that implies for a moment. A man not yet old enough to rent a car in most American states was simultaneously serving as the head writer, the lead creative decision-maker, and the voice of 3 separate central characters on a brand new primetime network television series, one that would go on to become one of the most recognizable and most discussed animated programs in the history of the medium. His broader career has continued accumulating honors well beyond the music and the animation. In 2019, he received a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. The following year, in 2020, he was formally inducted into the Television Academy's Hall of Fame, a genuinely prestigious industry honor reserved for figures considered to have made a lasting, foundational impact on the medium of television itself. And in a genuinely delightful, slightly absurd little footnote that feels almost like something out of one of his own show's cutaway gags, a newly identified species of stream tree frog discovered in Ecuador in 2022 was formally named Hylocertus sethmacfarlanei in his honor, a tiny, very real amphibian now, permanently carrying his name through the scientific literature. His philanthropic work, while perhaps less discussed by casual fans than the controversies surrounding his television shows, has also been substantial and sustained over the years. Through his own charitable foundation, MacFarlane has supported a wide range of causes, including cancer research, ocean conservation through the organization Oceana, science communication efforts, and civil rights advocacy through groups like the Human Rights Campaign. He has been a particularly consistent supporter of public radio, having made a $2 million donation to National Public Radio at the national level, along with an additional $500,000 gift specifically directed toward a regional public radio station in Southern California. He has also funded the preservation of an entire archive connected to astronomer Carl Sagan and his collaborator Ann Druyan, housed at the Library of Congress, a donation that connects directly back to his executive producer role on the Cosmos documentary series and speaks to a genuine, long-running personal interest in science communication that runs in parallel to everything else on his professional plate. Let's pause once more before we move toward the genuine close of tonight's story. Drop your location and your local time into the comments if you haven't yet, and make sure that subscribe button is tapped because there's still a little more ground to cover before we let you drift off for the night. As we settle into this final stretch, I want to take a moment to simply sit back together with everything we've walked through tonight, not to repeat it, but to look at the whole shape of it from a little further away, the way you might step back from a painting after staring closely at individual brushstrokes for a long time. What we've really been tracing tonight isn't just the history of a single cartoon. It's the story of how American television itself changed shape across a quarter century, told entirely through the lens of one stubbornly persistent animated family in a fictional Rhode Island town. Think about the sheer number of separate industries this one show has quietly touched along the way. The disc pressing and home video industry, which Family Guy fundamentally altered by becoming the very first television series in history to be revived primarily on the strength of its DVD sales rather than traditional ratings, a genuine first in the medium's history that opened the door for other networks to reconsider canceled shows in an entirely new light. The cable rerun and syndication business, which the show's improbable run on Adult Swim helped reshape by demonstrating just how much untapped value could be sitting inside a property that a broadcast network had already given up on. The streaming industry, which the show has now adapted to so completely that it ranks among the very most watched programs on one of the largest streaming platforms in the world, generating tens of billions of minutes of viewing time in a single year, even as its traditional old-fashioned live broadcast ratings have shrunk down to a tiny fraction of what they once commanded on a Wednesday night. The merchandising and licensing industry, which has turned a fictional family of 6, plus a talking dog, into a billion-dollar commercial engine spanning board games, pinball machines, mobile applications, and shelves of branded apparel sold in retail stores around the world. And the legal and regulatory landscape itself, which this single show has tested and pushed against more consistently, more publicly, and for longer than almost any other piece of scripted American television in living memory, drawing formal complaints from a sitting vice presidential candidate's family, a foreign government's justice minister, a beloved comedy legend, a major music publishing house, and a federal regulatory agency, all without ever once being forced off the air entirely. And underneath every single one of those separate threads sits one consistent, almost stubborn fact. A 24-year-old animator, working alone in his kitchen on a shoestring budget that wouldn't cover a single modern episode's catering bill, sat down and built something that, 27 years later, is still being watched, still generating headlines, still drawing both devoted fans and passionate critics, and is now formally locked into a renewal deal that will carry it all the way to its 30th anniversary and likely well beyond. Very few creative projects of any kind in any medium manage that kind of staying power. Fewer still manage it while remaining as consistently, deliberately controversial as this one has chosen to be at nearly every single step along the way. If you've made it through this entire long, winding, late-night story with me tonight, genuinely, thank you. Thank you for letting this quiet little corner of the internet be the thing keeping you company tonight, whether you're winding down before bed, working through a long night shift somewhere on the other side of the world, or just looking for something steady and unhurried to listen to while your mind settles. Make sure you're subscribed if you'd like to be here for the next one of these slow, detailed deep dives into the strange, hidden histories behind the shows and stories we all think we already know. And if tonight's journey through this one helped you relax, helped you drift off, or simply gave you something worth carrying into tomorrow, leave a like on your way out, just so this little channel knows to keep making more of them. Sleep well, wherever in the world you happen to be tonight. Let's settle in for one more chapter of tonight's story, because there's a particular kind of episode Family Guy has occasionally produced that stands in genuinely stark contrast to almost everything else we've discussed tonight. Episodes where the show deliberately sets aside its trademark chaos and tries, however imperfectly, to simply sit with something quiet and serious for 22 straight minutes. Before we get into it, take a moment to drop your location and your local time into the comments, and if you've been enjoying this slow, unhurried walk through the show's history, make sure that subscribe button is tapped. The clearest and most celebrated example of this is an episode simply titled Brian and Stewie, which aired during the show's 7th season and holds the distinction of being its 150th episode overall. The premise is almost shockingly simple for a show built on relentless, rapid-fire cutaways. Brian and Stewie find themselves accidentally locked inside an empty bank vault over an entire weekend, with no way out and nothing to do but talk to each other. And that's it. That's the whole episode. There are no flashback cutaways. There is no jumping away to an unrelated scene featuring a celebrity parody or a random pop culture reference. According to detailed breakdowns of the episode's production, it stands as the only installment in the show's entire run where Seth MacFarlane is individually credited as having performed every single piece of voice work himself, since Brian and Stewie are both, of course, his own voices. And the script called for nobody else to appear. What unfolds over those 22 minutes is, by a wide margin, one of the most quietly devastating things the show has ever produced. Trapped together with nothing else to focus on, Brian and Stewie begin opening up to each other about their actual inner lives in a way the show almost never allows its characters to do. Stewie, going through Brian's belongings, out of simple boredom, discovers that Brian keeps a handgun locked away in a safety deposit box, specifically because he has, at points, thought seriously about ending his own life. The two characters sit with that revelation together, talking honestly about loneliness, about purpose, about what their unusual friendship actually means to each of them, stripped entirely of the show's usual armor of jokes and tangents. Longtime fans and television critics alike have pointed to this episode for years as genuine proof that the show's writers and performers were fully capable of producing something emotionally serious and well-crafted whenever they actually chose to commit to it without immediately undercutting the moment with a cutaway gag. It's worth noting that even this carefully restrained, deliberately serious episode wasn't entirely without its own internal contradictions. Critics revisiting the episode have pointed out that even amid all of that genuine emotional honesty, the writers still found room to wedge in a fairly graphic, gross-out subplot involving one of Stewie's soiled diapers, a tonal choice that some reviewers felt undercut the otherwise unusually mature register of the rest of the episode. It's a small but telling detail, a reminder that even when this particular show is at its most reflective and restrained, it still can't fully resist reaching for at least one moment of pure, unfiltered crudeness somewhere along the way. A few seasons later, the show attempted something similar with an episode called Screams of Silence, the story of Brenda Q, which aired during season 10 and took on the subject of domestic violence directly, following the recurring character Brenda, sister of the Griffin's neighbor Glenn Quagmire, as she endures sustained physical and emotional abuse from her boyfriend. Unlike the gentle, internally focused tone of Brian and Stewie, this particular attempt at a serious episode landed with the press and the public in a dramatically different way. The episode follows Quagmire, Peter, and Joe as they ultimately decide to take matters into their own hands and kill Brenda's abuser themselves, then conceal the act from her entirely, presenting her instead with a forged note suggesting he simply chose to leave. The reaction from television critics and entertainment journalists was overwhelmingly negative and arrived quickly. Multiple outlets specifically criticized the episode for what they described as a deeply uncomfortable tonal mismatch between its genuinely serious subject matter and the show's usual comedic instincts, arguing that the story ultimately framed Brenda's own prolonged denial about her situation as something close to a punchline, rather than treating her experience with the seriousness the subject matter demanded. One entertainment writer at the time went so far as to suggest the episode might have been better off joining the small handful of installments that Fox had previously declined to broadcast altogether, rather than airing as a regular part of the season. It stands today as one of the more frequently cited examples whenever critics discuss the specific risks the show runs, whenever it tries to blend its established comedic identity with subject matter that genuinely deserves a more careful, dedicated treatment. These two episodes, sitting only a few seasons apart from each other, offer a genuinely interesting little case study in exactly how unpredictable this show's instincts could be whenever it stepped outside its usual comfort zone. One earned lasting critical praise as proof of genuine, restrained emotional depth hiding underneath all the chaos. The other became a frequently cited example of exactly the kind of tonal miscalculation that has fueled so much of the broader critical conversation about the show's later years. Both, in their own very different ways, reveal just how much creative range this particular writer's room was capable of reaching for, even if it didn't always land where it was aiming. Let's pause once more before we continue, the way we have throughout tonight. Drop your location and your local time into the comments if you haven't already, and if tonight's story has been good company, please do take a moment to hit that subscribe button. There's still more to cover before we close things out. There's a broader pattern worth touching on here too, because the show has periodically reached for serious or dramatically heightened subject matter across a surprisingly wide range of episodes beyond just these two. There was an episode dealing directly with one of the most fraught and politically charged subjects in modern American life, built around Peter accidentally shooting a young black character named Cleveland Jr., a storyline that critics and viewers immediately connected to the real-world killing of Trayvon Martin, a connection the show's own writers have acknowledged as a deliberate, if uncomfortable, source of inspiration. There was an episode dealing with religious conversion and extremism, following Peter as he befriends a Muslim neighbor and considers converting to Islam himself, only to discover that his new friend is secretly planning an act of terrorism, a storyline that drew sharp criticism from multiple directions for how it handled questions of religious identity and stereotype. There was an episode centered on Quagmire's own father undergoing gender transition, which, despite MacFarlane's own public insistence that the writers approached the subject with genuine care and sensitivity, drew substantial criticism for how several of the other characters were written to react to the storyline, even as critics generally praised the central performance itself. And then, of course, there's the crossover event we touched on briefly earlier tonight, the episode bringing the Griffins into direct contact with the Simpson family. That episode, too, generated its own dedicated wave of controversy, with the Parents Television Council specifically singling out a particular prank phone call gag involving the recurring Simpsons character Mo Sislak as needlessly crude, and with broader critical reaction split fairly evenly on whether blending Family Guy's much darker, more aggressively transgressive style of humor with the Simpsons' comparatively gentler, more traditionally family-oriented tone actually worked as a piece of television at all. Regardless of the historic novelty of finally seeing these two long-feuding animated families share the same screen after so many years of mutual public sniping between their respective creative teams. Taken together, all of these individual episodes paint a picture of a show that has spent 25 years constantly testing its own limits in both directions at once, sometimes reaching for genuine emotional depth and finding it, sometimes reaching for serious subject matter and badly misjudging the tone, and almost always generating exactly the kind of passionate, divided public reaction that keeps a show culturally relevant decades after most of its contemporaries have quietly faded from the conversation entirely. As we move now toward the true close of tonight's long, winding journey, let's take one final, slow lap back through the shape of everything we've covered, not to repeat the details, but simply to sit with how strange and unlikely the whole picture looks once you step back far enough to see it all at once. A thesis film made by an exhausted art student, a sequel short broadcast quietly on a children's cartoon block, a 15-minute pilot animated entirely alone in a kitchen by a 24-year-old who would, within months, become the youngest showrunner in the history of American television, a premiere slot inherited from a football game, 2 separate cancellations, an unprecedented, genuinely historic revival fueled by ordinary people buying DVDs and staying up late for cable reruns. A creator who built an entire second career as a big band vocalist performing with some of the most prestigious orchestras in the world, alongside a third career directing feature films, alongside a fourth as an executive producer on serious science documentaries, all while gradually stepping back from the writer's room of the very cartoon that made his name a household word in the first place. A tangled, almost absurd corporate ownership structure spanning 2 entirely separate media conglomerates. A collection of formal complaints and lawsuits and government objections spanning religious watchdog groups, federal regulators, a beloved comedy legend, a foreign justice minister, and a former vice presidential candidate's own family. $1 billion in cumulative revenue, and counting. And underneath every single one of those threads, a fictional family in a fictional Rhode Island town that has somehow, against every reasonable expectation, remained part of the cultural conversation for more than a quarter of a century, with 4 more seasons now locked in and a 30th anniversary already circled on the calendar. If you've stayed with me through this entire long, unhurried story tonight, thank you genuinely for letting it keep you company. Make sure you're subscribed if you'd like to be here for the next one of these slow, detailed deep dives into the hidden histories behind the shows we all think we already know. And if tonight helped you settle in, helped you relax, or simply gave you something steady to listen to while the rest of the world quieted down around you, leave a like on your way out so this channel knows to keep making more of them. Sleep well wherever you are tonight. Let's spend our final stretch of tonight's story on the people behind the other voices in this family, because the principal cast of Family Guy has, almost without exception, gone on to build genuinely remarkable careers of their own, often in directions that have very little to do with the cartoon that first made them household names. Before we settle into it, take a moment, if you haven't yet, to drop your location and your local time into the comments, And make sure that subscribe button is tapped if tonight's story has been good company for you. Alex Borstein, who has voiced Lois Griffin since the very beginning, almost didn't get to keep the role at all. She has spoken publicly about how, during the transition from the original pilot presentation into the full-ordered series, the network actually wanted to recast her, forcing her to re-audition for a part she had already originated, competing directly against what she has described as essentially every working actress in Hollywood at the time. She held onto the role, and it's a good thing she did, because Lois has remained one of the single most consistent through lines across the entire 25-year run of the show. Borstein came to Family Guy directly from her work as a cast member on the sketch comedy series MAD-TV, where she had built a reputation playing a rotating cast of memorable, often deliberately abrasive recurring characters. She actually met Seth MacFarlane during that same period, back when MacFarlane was originally being courted to produce short animated inserts for Mad TV itself. The same arrangement that, as we discussed earlier tonight, eventually fell through and led him toward pitching Family Guy to Fox as a standalone series instead. Borstein has continued working steadily ever since, eventually finding a second wave of major mainstream success and critical acclaim, playing the sharp-tongued talent manager, Susie Meyerson, on the acclaimed streaming series The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, a role that earned her 2 separate Primetime Emmy Awards for Outstanding Supporting Actress in a Comedy Series. In a small, charming bit of trivia, the very same year she won her first Family Guy Emmy nomination for Outstanding Voiceover Performance, she also picked up her first Maisel win, meaning 2 entirely different facets of her career were both being formally celebrated by the television industry within the very same award season. Mila Kunis's path to the role of Meg Griffin carries its own genuinely interesting backstory. As we touched on earlier tonight, she was not the character's original voice. That distinction belongs to actress Lacey Chabert, who voiced Meg throughout the show's first season before departing, citing scheduling conflicts with her other ongoing acting commitments at the time. When the production needed a replacement, Kunis came in to audition almost entirely on the strength of her work playing the character Jackie on the sitcom That 70s Show, a role she had already been performing since she was just 14 years old. According to MacFarlane's own account of the audition process, shared years later during a Paley Center event, Kunis had a natural stage presence that immediately stood out, and the writers found themselves gradually shaping Meg's character around her specific comedic instincts, eventually steering the role toward what MacFarlane has described as a kind of resentful, perpetually overlooked archetype, comparing the character's evolving dynamic to the classic middle child frustration of Jan Brady from The Brady Bunch. Kunis has, of course, gone on to build an extensive and genuinely substantial film career entirely separate from her voice work, with major roles in films like Black Swan, for which she received widespread critical acclaim, along with Friends with Benefits, forgetting Sarah Marshall and Oz the Great and Powerful, all while continuing to voice Meg in essentially every single episode of Family Guy produced since that second season switch. Seth Green, who voices the Griffins' awkward, often overlooked son Chris, came to the role already an established young actor, having appeared in a long list of films throughout the 1990s. Green has built a particularly interesting parallel career of his own within the world of animation, specifically co-creating and executive producing the stop-motion sketch comedy series Robot Chicken, the very same show whose ongoing playful rivalry with Family Guy's Star Wars specials we touched on earlier tonight. There's a small, delightful bit of trivia connecting Green's 2 major television roles together as well. Years before either of them had any involvement with Family Guy, Borstein and Green had actually performed together on Mad TV, with Green occasionally appearing as a recurring mean boss character, and Borstein playing his overbearing mother in those same sketches. When MacFarlane brought them both onto Family Guy not long after, Borstein found herself once again cast as Green's mother, this time as Lois Griffin to his Chris Griffin, an odd little continuity of comedic chemistry carried over from one show directly into the next almost entirely by coincidence. Patrick Warburton, the voice behind the Griffins' wheelchair-using neighbor Joe Swanson, arrived at the role already widely recognized for his earlier, scene-stealing recurring performance as David Puddy on the massively popular sitcom Seinfeld. Warburton has gone on to become one of the more prolific and instantly recognizable voice actors working in modern animation, lending his deep, deadpan vocal style to major characters across an enormous range of other projects, including the role of Kronk in Disney's The Emperor's New Groove, a part widely regarded as one of the more beloved comedic supporting performances in that entire film's legacy, alongside voice work in B-Movie and a live-action turn as the mysterious narrator Lemony Snicket in Netflix's adaptation of A Series of Unfortunate Events. He also reunited with MacFarlane directly outside of the animated world, taking a supporting role in the live-action film Ted. Mike Henry occupies a particularly unusual position within the show's broader cast, because unlike most of his fellow principal voice actors, he has also worked directly within the writer's room itself across the years, blending performance and scripting responsibilities in a way that few other members of the cast have. He voices both Cleveland Brown, the Griffin's soft-spoken, perpetually mild-mannered neighbor, and the wildly different, sexually adventurous Glenn Quagmire, two characters that could hardly sound or behave more differently from one another, alongside a rotating list of additional smaller recurring roles across the show's enormous ensemble. According to accounts of how he initially connected with MacFarlane, the two actually first crossed paths years before Family Guy existed at all, having become friends through a mutual connection involving Henry's brother, long before either of them had any idea the partnership would eventually anchor one of the longest-running animated comedies in television history. There's one more wonderfully unexpected piece of casting trivia worth mentioning before we close things out tonight, connected to the character of Joe Swanson's wife, Bonnie. The role has been voiced from the very beginning by actress Jennifer Tilly, an actress with a genuinely substantial career of her own well before Family Guy ever existed, including an Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actress for her work in the 1994 film Bullets Over Broadway, a role she has noted she actually self-submitted for award consideration. Tilly has also originated and repeatedly reprised the voice of the murderous doll character Tiffany Valentine across the long-running Child's Play horror film franchise, a genuinely strange and delightful juxtaposition to sit alongside her work playing a fairly ordinary suburban housewife on a Sunday night animated sitcom. And running through every single one of these individual stories, tying the entire enormous cast together across 25 years, sits Seth MacFarlane himself, who, according to estimates gathered across the show's full run, has personally performed well over 700 distinct individual voices across the life of the series, a number that includes not just the 4 central characters most viewers immediately associate with him, but an enormous, ever-expanding roster of one-off background characters, minor recurring figures, and incidental voices scattered across literally hundreds of individual episodes, all coming out of the same exhausted, endlessly versatile vocal instrument that first brought Larry and Steve to life in a college dorm room more than 30 years ago. We've traveled together tonight from a thesis film made by a sleepless art student all the way through a streaming empire generating tens of billions of minutes of viewership in a single year, through 2 cancellations and 1 improbable resurrection, through a recording booth carrying 700 separate voices in one man's throat, through lawsuits and government complaints and a frog named in someone's honor, through a Star Trek tribute that needed its own original score, and a Star Wars trilogy born out of a legal threat that turned into a blessing, through a family of actors whose careers have stretched in directions none of them likely could have predicted back when they were all just gathering in a small recording booth for the very first time. But there's still a little more tucked away in the corners of this story before we let the night close all the way around us. So let's keep going just a while longer. Let's drift now into the earliest, almost forgotten stretch of casting history behind the show, because before Mila Kunis or even Lacey Chabert ever stepped behind a microphone for the role of Meg Griffin, a third actress had already been attached to the part entirely. According to behind-the-scenes accounts from the production, voice actress Cree Summer, well known to an entire generation of viewers for originating the role of Elmira Duff on Tiny Toon Adventures, was actually the very first person hired to voice Meg, recording material for the original pilot presentation pitched to Fox executives. She was let go from the production before that material was ever used, and the role passed to Chabert for the official first season instead, making Meg, by a wide margin, the single most recast major character in the entire history of the show, having technically passed through 3 different performers before Kunis's now permanent tenure in the role ever began. There's a similarly obscure but genuinely charming piece of trivia tucked into the show's very earliest visual design history as well. According to reporting gathered from people who knew MacFarlane during his time as a student, the specific physical look of Peter Griffin, the rounded body shape, the heavy jaw, the general silhouette that has now been reproduced on more pieces of merchandise than almost any other cartoon character of the last quarter century, was reportedly influenced in part by a real administrator MacFarlane interacted with regularly during his college years, a detail the man in question has apparently confirmed and spoken about with some pride in later interviews, joking that he is, in a very literal sense, the visual inspiration behind one of the most recognizable cartoon silhouettes in modern television. Let's pause here once more, the way we have all throughout tonight. If you're still with me, drop your location and your local time into the comments below, and if this kind of slow, detail-rich storytelling has been good company for your evening, make sure that subscribe button is tapped before we keep going just a little further. Let's spend a few more minutes thinking about the sheer mechanical scale of what it actually takes to keep a single television show running continuously for this long, because the numbers involved are genuinely worth sitting with. As of recent counts, Family Guy has produced well over 400 individual episodes across its full run, a figure that places it among a genuinely small handful of American scripted television series ever to cross that particular threshold. For context, that puts it in rare company alongside shows like The Simpsons, which remains the longest-running scripted primetime series in American television history by a wide margin, and the various incarnations of the Law and Order franchise. Crossing 400 episodes means that the show has now been in continuous production, with only the interruptions of strikes and that one multi-year cancellation gap for roughly a quarter of a century, an almost incomprehensible amount of sustained creative output from any single ongoing production. Each of those individual episodes represents months of overlapping work happening simultaneously across multiple separate stages of production. While one batch of episodes is being written and storyboarded in Los Angeles, an earlier batch is likely deep into the animation process at one of the show's overseas partner studios in South Korea, while an even earlier batch, already fully animated, is being scored, mixed, and prepared for broadcast. At any given moment, a show with this kind of episode volume typically has somewhere between a dozen and 24 individual episodes in some active stage of production simultaneously, spread across writers, storyboard artists, animators, composers, and voice actors working in overlapping but staggered waves. It's a genuinely staggering logistical operation hiding behind 22 minutes of cartoon chaos delivered to your television screen once a week. Let's take one more pause together before we settle all the way into the close of tonight's story. Drop your location and your local time into the comments if you haven't yet. And if you've made it this far, the subscribe button really would mean a great deal for a channel like this one. There's one final thread worth pulling on before we let the night close around us completely, and it has to do with just how unusual it is for any single piece of media to remain this contested, this discussed, and this commercially vital for a full 25 years without ever fully settling into either complete cultural irrelevance or complete uncritical acceptance. Most television shows, even genuinely beloved and successful ones, eventually settle into a kind of quiet nostalgia, fondly remembered but no longer actively argued about, no longer generating fresh news cycles, no longer drawing genuinely passionate disagreement between people who love it and people who can't stand it. Family Guy, for better or worse, has never quite been allowed to settle into that kind of comfortable retirement. It is still, as of tonight, generating new episodes. It is still drawing organized criticism from advocacy groups. It is still topping streaming charts. It is still locked into a renewal deal that guarantees its continued existence for years into the future. And it is still, somehow, the exact same fictional family in the exact same fictional Rhode Island town that a 24-year-old animator first sketched out alone in his kitchen, fueled by exhaustion and ambition, back when the world was still getting used to the idea of the internet, let alone the idea of an animated sitcom being revived from cancellation by DVD sales alone. That kind of staying power doesn't happen by accident, and it doesn't happen purely through inertia or corporate momentum either. However much the financial machinery behind the show has clearly played its own enormous role in keeping it alive across the leaner, more critically contested years. It happens because, buried somewhere underneath 25 years of cutaway gags, controversy, cast changes, corporate acquisitions, and shifting creative direction, there is still, even now, some small flicker of whatever it was that made a college professor at the Rhode Island School of Design decide a student's strange little thesis film about a dim-witted man and his sarcastic dog was worth mailing off to a major animation studio in the first place. Let's spend a little more time tonight on the legal side of the show's history, because the Carol Burnett lawsuit we touched on earlier deserves a slightly fuller telling, given just how directly it connects this animated sitcom to one of the most beloved figures in the entire history of American television comedy. Carol Burnett, the legendary host of her own long-running variety show decades before Family Guy ever existed, filed a $6 million lawsuit against 20th Century Fox back in March of 2007 after a Family Guy cutaway gag depicted a cleaning woman character clearly modeled on Burnett's own famous charwoman persona, a character she had originated and performed for years on her own show, engaging in sexually suggestive behavior with Peter Griffin. Burnett argued the depiction violated both trademark protections tied to the character and her own personal publicity rights, essentially arguing that Family Guy had taken a piece of her own personal creative legacy and twisted it into something she had never consented to and would never have approved of herself. The case made its way to federal court, where a judge ultimately ruled in June of that same year that the parody was protected under the First Amendment, drawing on the same legal precedent established by the landmark Hustler magazine versus Falwell Supreme Court case, which had famously protected satirical depictions of public figures decades earlier. It's a genuinely fascinating little intersection of legal history, two very different eras of American television comedy colliding directly in a federal courtroom, with the broader principles of free speech and parody protection ultimately determining where exactly the line sits between affectionate homage and unauthorized commercial exploitation of someone else's life's work. Let's pause once more here, the way we have all throughout tonight. Drop your location and your local time into the comments if you haven't yet, and if tonight's story has been the right kind of company for your evening, make sure that subscribe button is tapped. There's another small but genuinely interesting piece of the show's visual history worth mentioning before we close things out completely. Connected to a fairly significant technical transition the production went through partway through its run. For years, Family Guy was produced and broadcast in the older, boxier 4:3 aspect ratio that had defined television broadcasting for most of the 20th century, the same shape you'd see on an old tube television set. As the broader television industry gradually shifted toward widescreen high-definition broadcasting throughout the 2000s, Family Guy eventually made that same transition itself, switching over to the wider 16:9 format, starting with a particular episode that also happened to update the show's opening title sequence to match the new aspect ratio. That transition meant going back and reworking the visual presentation of the iconic title card and updating some of the show's foundational visual branding for the first time since its earliest seasons, a genuinely significant production milestone that longtime fans still use as a quick visual marker for roughly dating any individual episode at a glance, simply based on whether it's presented in the old boxy format or the newer widescreen one. The show's relationship with its mobile gaming audience deserves a moment of attention too, because it represents one of the more financially successful and somewhat unexpected extensions of the franchise into an entirely new medium. Family Guy: The Quest for Stuff, a free-to-play mobile city-building game built around collecting and arranging familiar locations and characters from the show, launched in the mid-2010s and became a genuinely significant commercial success within the broader mobile gaming industry, generating substantial ongoing revenue through in-app purchases for years after its initial release. It's a quiet but telling example of just how thoroughly this particular animated property has managed to embed itself into nearly every available corner of modern entertainment and commerce, from primetime broadcast television all the way down to the smartphone sitting in someone's pocket while they wait for a bus, decades after the original characters were first sketched out by hand in a college dorm room. Let's take one more pause together before we finally let tonight's story settle all the way down. If you're still here, drop your location and your local time into the comments below one final time. And if you've genuinely enjoyed this long, unhurried walk through the hidden history of this one strange, persistent little cartoon, the subscribe button really would mean a great deal coming from you. As we bring tonight's story toward its true close, there's one more piece of the puzzle worth setting down before we get there. A strange little experiment the show ran fairly early into its post-revival years that tells you a lot about how this particular production has always approached the boundary between television and film. Back in September of 2005, not long after the show's fourth season had successfully relaunched on Fox, the production released a direct-to-DVD feature called Family Guy Presents Stewie Griffin, The Untold Story, marking 20th Century Fox's first direct-to-video animated release in years. The central premise follows Stewie, in the aftermath of a near-death experience, spotting a man on television who looks exactly like him, and becoming convinced, given how little he believes he resembles his own dim-witted father Peter, that this stranger must be his actual biological father. That conviction sends him on a cross-country road trip in search of answers, ultimately leading to a genuinely strange, time-travel-infused revelation involving a future version of himself. The film opens with an elaborate fictional movie premiere sequence packed with celebrity cameos and background gags, featuring guest voice contributions from Drew Barrymore, who also appears as a character at the premiere alongside a fictional date, the late Mayor Adam West, actress Jason Priestley, Tori Spelling, and comedian Joy Behar, alongside the show's full regular cast. What makes the project genuinely interesting from a production standpoint is how it actually came together behind the scenes. Rather than being conceived from the ground up as a single continuous feature film, the project was originally written as 3 separate standalone television episodes, each penned by a different writer on the staff, before being stitched together with new connective material into a single 88-minute direct-to-video release. Those 3 component segments were eventually also edited down and aired separately on broadcast television the following year as part of the show's regular season 4 finale, meaning that dedicated fans actually had 2 genuinely different ways to experience the same underlying material, either as one continuous film on DVD or as 3 separate, slightly altered episodes broadcast individually on Fox. Critical reaction to the release was largely positive, with reviewers generally praising its consistently high joke density, even as several specifically noted that the format struggled somewhat to sustain a single coherent narrative thread across a full feature-length runtime. An observation that, fairly or not, echoes some of the same structural criticism that would later be leveled at individual episodes of the regular series, as the cutaway-heavy approach to comedy became more dominant in the years that followed. One particular cutaway gag buried within the film, depicting a religious figure performing a parody of a real magician's signature stage act, ended up generating its own small legal footnote, drawing a copyright infringement lawsuit from the original performer being parodied, a case that was eventually settled out of court years later under undisclosed terms, joining the now familiar pattern of legal entanglements that seem to follow nearly every major creative swing this production has ever taken. Let's pause here once more, the way we have all throughout tonight. If you're still with me, drop your location and your local time into the comments below. And if this kind of long, unhurried storytelling has been good company for your evening, make sure that subscribe button is tapped before we let the night finally settle all the way down around us. There's one more genuinely fun thread worth pulling before we let things settle all the way down, connected to the show's relationship with live performance and the broader comedy world beyond television. Beyond the recording booth and the writer's room, the cast of Family Guy has periodically taken the show out into the world in front of live audiences. As we touched on earlier tonight, a series of stage shows billed as Family Guy Live brought cast members out to read classic episodes aloud and perform musical numbers from the show's own Broadway-style soundtrack album, drawing sold-out crowds of roughly 1,200 people at each individual performance in cities, including Los Angeles and New York. These shows grew out of an earlier, smaller performance the cast had given at the Montreal Comedy Festival, and they eventually led to a full primetime television special in 2009, in which MacFarlane and Alex Borstein performed live song and dance numbers from the show, including a memorably absurd parody sequence built around a Lady Gaga hit, complete with a surprise guest appearance from a respected dramatic actress stepping in to needle the performance mid-number. MacFarlane's own comedic reputation beyond Family Guy extended into one of the more distinctly merciless corners of American comedy as well, the celebrity roast circuit run for years by Comedy Central. He has served as a roaster across several of these high-profile televised events, taking aim at major public figures in front of a packed room of fellow comedians, a format that draws directly on exactly the kind of escalating, audience-baiting, deliberately uncomfortable humor that has defined so much of his television work. It's a natural fit in some ways, given how much of his career has been built around testing precisely how far a joke can be pushed before it stops being funny and starts being something else entirely. The exact same tightrope his own writer's room has spent 25 years walking, episode after episode, with wildly varying degrees of success depending entirely on who you ask and which particular season you happen to be talking about. Let's pause once more, the way we have all throughout tonight. If you're still with me, drop your location and your local time into the comments below, and if tonight's story has been good company for your evening, make sure that subscribe button is tapped. It's worth sitting too with just how unusual MacFarlane's specific path into the entertainment industry actually was, compared to almost anyone else who has ever run a major American television show. Most successful showrunners spend years, sometimes decades, working their way up through writers' rooms on other people's shows before ever getting the chance to build something entirely their own. MacFarlane skipped almost all of that. He went directly from a handful of years as a working animator and writer at Hanna-Barbera, contributing to other people's established shows, straight into creating, writing, voicing, and overseeing every creative aspect of his own brand new primetime series, all before he had even turned 25. There was no slow climb through the ranks, no years spent quietly learning the business on someone else's payroll before getting his own shot. There was a thesis film, a sequel short, a tiny budget, 6 months of sleepless nights in a kitchen, and then, almost without any of the usual intermediate steps, a network television premiere slot immediately following one of the most watched broadcasts of the entire year. That kind of compressed, accelerated career arc tends to produce one of two outcomes. Either the person flames out quickly, overwhelmed by responsibilities they were never given the normal amount of time to grow into, or they end up building something so thoroughly shaped by their own singular, unfiltered creative instincts that it becomes almost impossible to separate the show from the specific person who made it, for better and for worse, in exactly the way critics and fans alike have spent 25 years arguing about when it comes to Family Guy. There was no committee smoothing out the rough edges in those first 3 seasons. There was no slow, gradual institutional process diluting the original creative vision before it ever reached the screen. It was, almost entirely, just one extremely young, extremely talented, extremely exhausted person's specific, idiosyncratic sense of humor, broadcast directly into millions of homes with very little standing between his imagination and your television screen. That same accelerated, almost reckless creative momentum is, in a strange way, probably the closest thing to a single unifying explanation for everything we've talked about across this entire long night together. It explains why the show could be canceled twice and somehow claw its way back from the dead both times. Because whatever that original creative spark actually was, it turned out to be durable enough and distinctive enough to survive years of silence and still find an audience waiting for it on the other side. It explains why the show has weathered so much organized criticism without ever fully backing down from its own instincts, because the entire project was built, from the very beginning, around the idea of pushing exactly as far as one specific creative voice was willing to push, regardless of who objected along the way. And it explains why, even now, more than a quarter century and 400 episodes later, with its creator largely stepped back from the actual day-to-day writing, with its corporate ownership split across 2 entirely different media conglomerates, with its live broadcast ratings a tiny fraction of what they once were, the show still somehow feels at its core like the exact same fundamentally strange, fundamentally personal thing one 24-year-old animator built alone in his kitchen, fueled by exhaustion and stubbornness and a genuine, undeniable talent that even a brand new network with almost no faith in him couldn't quite ignore. There's one more thread of international controversy worth adding to everything we discussed earlier tonight about the Venezuela ban and the Sarah Palin controversy, because Family Guy's friction with foreign governments did not end back in 2009. The show holds the distinction of being the only animated series ever banned outright, in full, across more than 10 separate countries, including Indonesia, Taiwan, South Africa, Iran, Russia, Vietnam, Egypt, Malaysia, and South Korea, the very same country where a significant portion of its animation has actually been produced for years. The specific reasoning behind each individual ban varies considerably from nation to nation. Egypt's restriction has been attributed to general moral and religious censorship standards. Iran's objection centers specifically on the show's inclusion of gay characters and storylines. Russia's relationship with the show has been particularly fraught and surprisingly recent. Back in 2023, a two-part season finale storyline sent the character Meg to the real Russian city of Chelyabinsk, where she becomes romantically entangled with a man who, it turns out, is only interested in marrying her to obtain a green card. The episodes included a deliberately exaggerated musical number mocking the city, modeled loosely on the introductory song from the animated film Beauty and the Beast, and the depiction proved genuinely upsetting to actual Russian regional officials, with one regional government deputy publicly accusing the show of engaging in a deliberate campaign of information warfare against the country. As of the most recent reporting on the matter, a full formal ban tied specifically to that storyline had not yet been implemented, though it represents the most recent entry in a remarkably long, remarkably international list of governments and officials who have, at one point or another across this show's 25-year history, taken the time to formally object to a cartoon about a dysfunctional family in a fictional Rhode Island town. Let's spend a few final minutes tonight thinking about something a little more reflective, something that sits underneath all of the individual facts and dates and lawsuits we've covered, because there's a genuine philosophical question buried inside the story of a show this old, this contested, and this strange. What does it actually mean for a single piece of creative work to remain in active production for 25 consecutive years? Most forms of art simply don't work that way. A novel gets written, published, and then exists, fixed and unchanging, for as long as anyone wants to read it. A film gets shot, edited, released, and then exists in exactly the same form forever afterward. However, the world around it continues to change. But a long-running television show is something fundamentally different from either of those things. It is less like a single finished object and more like an ongoing, living process, a structure that keeps absorbing new writers, new animators, new cultural references, new technology, and even new corporate owners, while somehow remaining recognizable, season after season, as the same underlying thing. Family Guy has now been through that process for longer than most of its own current viewers have been alive. Someone born the year the show first premiered, back in January of 1999, is now well into their 20s, has potentially graduated college, started a career, maybe even started a family of their own, all while this same fictional cartoon family has continued going about its business on a weekly basis in the background of American culture virtually the entire time. Few other pieces of media manage that particular kind of persistence, the ability to simply remain present, season after season, generation after generation of viewers, without ever fully concluding, without ever offering the kind of clean, satisfying final chapter that most stories eventually provide their audience. There's something almost comforting in that, in a strange way, even setting aside every legitimate criticism the show has accumulated across its run. In a media landscape that increasingly moves toward limited series, single seasons, quick cancellations, and content built to be consumed once and then discarded, there's something genuinely unusual about a show that simply keeps existing, keeps showing up, keeps generating new episodes every single week, year after year, regardless of whether any individual viewer happens to be paying close attention at any given moment. You can step away from Family Guy for 5 years and come back to find it still there, still running, the Griffins still living in the same house, Peter still working at the same brewery, Stewie still occasionally threatening some half-hearted scheme, the whole strange little world still humming along exactly where you left it, even as the specific episodes themselves have continued quietly changing and evolving underneath that surface-level consistency the entire time. That kind of durability isn't necessarily a mark of quality. And it certainly isn't proof that every single one of those 400-plus episodes represents the show at its very best. But it is, undeniably, a mark of something, a persistence, a stubbornness, a willingness on the part of everyone involved across 25 years and 2 corporate owners and dozens of rotating writers to simply keep showing up and making the next episode, week after week, long after the cultural conversation has moved on to 100 other things, long after most other shows from that same era have quietly faded into nostalgia and reruns, long after any reasonable person might have expected the whole strange experiment to simply run out of steam and end. Let's spend one last few minutes thinking about what comes next for this strange little franchise. Because the renewal deal locking the show in through its 27th season and its 30th anniversary doesn't actually tell us much about what those final seasons might look like creatively. Television history is full of examples of long-running shows that continued well past the point where their original creative teams had any real involvement left, sustained almost entirely by syndication value and brand recognition rather than fresh storytelling ambition, and it's a fair question to ask whether Family Guy's next several seasons will lean further into that pattern or whether the show still has genuine creative surprises left in it. The recent expansion of the writing staff to include more women, which we touched on earlier tonight in connection with the gradual softening of Meg's treatment in more recent seasons, suggests at least some willingness within the current production to actively reconsider and adjust long-standing patterns that had drawn sustained criticism for over a decade. Whether that kind of internal course correction continues, accelerates, or quietly reverses itself in the years ahead remains genuinely an open question, one that only time, and several more years of new episodes, will actually answer. What does seem clear, looking back across everything we've covered tonight, is that this particular show has never been predictable in the conventional sense, even when its detractors have accused it of relying on predictable formulas season after season. A show that could be canceled twice and revived twice, that could kill off and resurrect one of its own central characters within the span of a single month, that could spend 3 entire seasons faithfully recreating someone else's film trilogy before going right back to its own original storylines, that could swing from a quietly devastating bottle episode about depression and friendship to a tone-deaf episode about domestic violence within the space of a few short seasons, has earned at least some benefit of the doubt when it comes to guessing what it might still have left to surprise its audience with, for better or for worse, as it heads toward its 30th year on the air. And there's a final, quieter point worth sitting with here too, one that has nothing to do with ratings or revenue or renewal deals at all. Across every single thread we followed tonight, the recording booth, the overseas animation studios, the lawsuits, the banned episodes, the Grammy nominations, the frog named in someone's honor, there's been one consistent presence running underneath all of it. A genuine, sustained act of creative labor carried out by hundreds of different people across 25 years, all working in service of something that started as one exhausted student's small, strange thesis film. Writers who came and went across different eras of the show, each leaving some small fingerprint on its tone before moving on to other projects. Animators in Los Angeles and Seoul who never appear in any credits most viewers actually read, quietly bringing thousands of individual not a slice of life every single week. Voice actors who built entire separate careers in the spaces between recording sessions. Composers translating jokes and emotional beats into musical cues. Lawyers navigating copyright claims and international censorship boards. Network executives weighing scheduling decisions against advertising revenue. All of it, every single piece, in service of keeping one fictional family in one fictional Rhode Island town alive and functioning on a weekly basis for a quarter of a century. An achievement that, regardless of where you personally land on the show's content or its decline or its controversies, represents a genuinely massive, genuinely collaborative human undertaking, sustained far longer than almost anyone involved at the very beginning could have reasonably expected. Let's take a few last minutes tonight to think about the audience side of this whole equation too, because everything we've discussed has largely focused on the people making the show, and it's worth remembering that none of it would mean anything without the millions of viewers who kept choosing, week after week, decade after decade, to let this particular fictional family back into their living rooms. There's a strange kind of intimacy that builds up between a long-running show and its audience that doesn't really exist with shorter, more contained pieces of media. People who started watching Family Guy as teenagers have, by now, watched entire chapters of their own lives unfold alongside it, moving through high school, college, first jobs, marriages, children of their own, all while this same fictional household kept humming along in the background, available whenever they wanted to drop back in. Some of those original viewers eventually drifted away, frustrated by the changes we've spent so much of tonight discussing. Others stuck around through every single shift in tone and quality, finding something worth returning to even in the seasons that critics were harshest about. And an entirely new generation has come to the show recently, often not through the original broadcast at all, but through short clips circulating on social media, through binge-watching old seasons on a streaming service, through the strange, decontextualized afterlife that so much older television now lives inside algorithmic recommendation feeds. Discovering Stewie's accent or Peter's fight with the giant chicken or a particular cutaway gag completely divorced from whatever season or storyline it originally belonged to. That fragmented, multi-generational relationship between a show and its audience is itself one of the more interesting, unintended consequences of a series running this long. A teenager discovering Family Guy clips on their phone tonight is encountering the exact same fictional universe that a viewer in their 40s first watched live after the Super Bowl back in January of 1999, but they are very likely encountering two almost entirely different versions of that universe, separated by 25 years of character changes, tonal shifts, animation upgrades, and creative turnover. Both of them are, in some sense, watching the same show. Neither of them is watching quite the same show as the other. And that strange, layered, accumulated history is exactly what we've spent this entire night trying to trace, one thread at a time, from a thesis film in a college dorm room all the way through to a streaming platform's most watched chart in the present day. There's a particular kind of comfort, too, in a piece of media that simply never quite goes away, that's always sitting there, available, familiar, ready to be returned to whenever you happen to want it, regardless of how long it's been since the last time you checked in. Family Guy has, for better or worse, become exactly that kind of fixture for an enormous number of people, a piece of media so deeply embedded into the broader cultural landscape that it barely registers anymore as something with an actual beginning, a specific origin point, a particular 24-year-old animator hunched over a drafting table in a kitchen, exhausted and uncertain whether anyone would ever actually watch the thing he was building. It simply exists now, the way certain landmarks or institutions simply exist, present in the cultural landscape regardless of whether any individual person happens to be paying close attention to it on any given night. And that, in the end, might be the strangest and most genuinely remarkable part of everything we've covered together tonight. Not the controversies, not the lawsuits, not the ratings collapse or the streaming resurgence or the corporate acquisitions, but simply the fact that this particular fictional family has been allowed, across 25 consecutive years, to remain a fixed, familiar point in an otherwise constantly shifting media landscape, something millions of people across multiple generations can return to, again and again, and still find, in some recognizable form, exactly where they left it. Think for a moment about everything else that has changed in the world since that fictional family first appeared on screen. The way people watch television has changed almost beyond recognition, moving from appointment viewing on a fixed weekly schedule to on-demand streaming available at any hour of any day. The way people discover new shows has changed, moving from word of mouth and television guide listings to algorithmic recommendations and short clips shared between friends. The very companies producing and distributing the show have changed, merged, been bought and sold and restructured, while the fictional Griffin household itself has remained sitting in the exact same modest house, on the exact same street, in the exact same fictional town, more or less untouched by any of it. There's something almost reassuring in that kind of stillness at the center of so much surrounding change, a fixed point that generations of viewers have been able to orient themselves around, even as literally everything surrounding that fixed point has continued shifting and evolving underneath it. And so we arrive, finally, at the actual close of tonight's long, winding story. I keep coming back to that single image we started with hours ago now. A 24-year-old art school graduate, alone in his own kitchen, with no real budget to speak of, hand-drawing and hand-voicing every single frame of a 15-minute pilot that he had no real way of knowing would ever amount to anything at all. He could not have known, sitting there exhausted and half asleep over his drafting table, that he was building something that would survive 2 separate cancellations, generate $1 billion in revenue, draw formal objections from a sitting government's justice minister, earn a historic Emmy nomination not given to an animated show in nearly 50 years, get named after by a newly discovered species of frog in a rainforest half a world away, and still, 27 years later, be locked into a contract guaranteeing its continued existence all the way through its 30th anniversary. None of that was visible from inside that kitchen back in 1998. All that existed then was the work itself. One drawing at a time, one voice at a time, one joke at a time, built by someone too tired and too stubborn to stop. There's a particular kind of person worth picturing here too. Before we let this story rest for good tonight, not MacFarlane himself, who we've spent so much of tonight with already, but the person on the other end of this whole long chain of events, the viewer. Somewhere out there tonight, just as there has been on countless nights across the last 25 years, someone is sitting down to watch a rerun of an episode they've probably already seen a dozen times. Not because they're searching for anything new, but because there's something genuinely comforting in returning to a world you already know completely, where the jokes land the way you remember them landing, where the characters behave the way you expect them to behave, where nothing about the experience asks anything new or difficult of you. That's a kind of value television rarely gets credited for, the simple, unglamorous comfort of total familiarity, and it's exactly the kind of value a show like this, 400 episodes deep and 25 years into its run, is uniquely positioned to provide in a way that a brand new, unproven series simply cannot. There's also something worth saying about the simple act of telling a story like this one slowly, the way we've done tonight, rather than rushing through it as a quick list of disconnected facts. Most of what circulates online about a show like Family Guy arrives in fragments. A single viral clip here, a single controversy headline there, a quick ranking of best or worst episodes assembled without much context, connecting one entry to the next. What gets lost in that fragmented way of encountering a long-running piece of media is the actual shape of its history, the sense of cause and effect linking one decision to the next, the way a scheduling change in 2001 quietly set in motion, a cancellation that, years later, somehow produced one of the strangest revival stories in television history, the way a single writer's room decision to retire Stewie's villainous side in Season 4 rippled outward across more than a decade of subsequent character development. Sitting with the full, connected version of that story, slowly, patiently, in order, tends to reveal things that the fragmented version never quite manages to show you, and that's really been the whole purpose of spending this long, unhurried night together going through it from the very beginning. And it's worth remembering, too, just how rare it actually is for any single creative endeavor to give you this much material to sit with in the first place. Most television shows simply don't generate 25 years of lawsuits, banned episodes, international diplomatic incidents, Grammy-nominated side careers, newly discovered amphibian species, and corporate ownership sagas spanning 2 separate media conglomerates. The sheer density of genuinely strange, genuinely documented history packed into this one show's run is itself a kind of testament to how much creative and commercial energy has been poured into it across a quarter century by an enormous number of people, even during the stretches when the show's actual episode-to-episode quality was being most heavily criticized by its own longtime audience. A show can be simultaneously declining in the eyes of many of its longtime fans and still be generating an almost unmanageable volume of genuinely fascinating, genuinely well-documented history behind the scenes, and Family Guy, perhaps more than almost any other piece of American television from the last quarter century, proves that those two things are not actually in any kind of contradiction with each other. And maybe that's the last thing worth leaving you with tonight before we finally let the story close all the way around us. Whatever you personally think of this show, whether you grew up loving it, whether you fell away from it somewhere around the seasons we discussed tonight as the clearest turning points in its decline, Whether you've never actually sat down and watched a full episode and have simply absorbed its existence through cultural osmosis the way most people eventually absorb any sufficiently long-running piece of media, it's genuinely hard to find another single example in modern American television of something that has survived this much, generated this much, and still, somehow, kept going. Not because it was protected from criticism, and not because it avoided controversy, but in many ways because of how directly and repeatedly it walked straight into both, season after season, for 25 straight years, and simply kept making the next episode anyway. One last small image before we close. Then, to send you off into whatever rest or quiet comes next for you tonight. Picture that recording booth one more time, the one we talked about toward the very beginning of tonight's story. The place where this entire sprawling 25-year saga has, in some sense, always physically lived. A single room, a single microphone, a man who has now voiced something approaching 1,000 distinct characters across more than 400 episodes, still showing up, session after session, year after year, decade after decade, long after the show could have reasonably been expected to end. Long after most people involved at the very beginning had any way of knowing it would still be running this far into the future. That image, more than any single statistic or controversy or lawsuit we've discussed tonight, might be the truest distillation of what this entire story actually is. Not a finished thing, not a closed chapter. Just one room, one voice, and 25 years of somebody simply continuing to show up. And if there is one final lesson buried inside a story this long and this strange, it might simply be this. Persistence, in any creative field, rarely looks the way people expect it to look from the outside. It isn't usually a single dramatic moment of triumph. It's mostly just quiet, repeated, unglamorous continuation. One episode after another, one season after another, through good years and bad ones, through critical acclaim and organized backlash alike, long after the initial excitement of any new project has worn away, and all that's left is the simple, stubborn decision to keep going anyway. That's the version of this story that doesn't usually make it into the headlines, or the controversy roundups, or the ranked lists of best and worst episodes. But it might be the truest version of it all the same. So as the night settles all the way down around us now, and as this long story finally comes to rest, I'll leave you with this. 25 years ago, almost nobody, including the person who built it, could have predicted any of what we spent tonight walking through together. Not the cancellations, not the revival, not the lawsuits, not the streaming numbers, not the frog, not the 30th anniversary already sitting on the calendar. All any of it ever really was, at the very start, was one tired, talented young person, drawing by hand, late at night, simply trying to see whether something he cared about might actually work. It worked, far beyond anything anyone involved could have reasonably expected. And 25 years later, here we are, still talking about it, still finding new corners of its history worth telling slowly, late at night, to whoever happens to be listening. Whatever comes next for this strange, sprawling, endlessly contested little show, whatever the next 4 seasons end up looking like, whatever new controversies or genuine creative surprises are still waiting somewhere ahead on the road to that 30th anniversary, it will, in some fundamental way, still be the same story we've been telling tonight, just with a few more chapters added onto the end of it. The same recording booth, the same fictional town, the same stubborn, unlikely persistence that has carried it this far already. And whenever that 30th anniversary actually does arrive, a few years from now, there will almost certainly be another version of a story, very much like this one being told somewhere, by someone, walking back through these same 25 years all over again, plus whatever strange new chapters get added between now and then. That's simply what happens to a piece of media once it survives long enough to become genuine history rather than just current entertainment. It stops belonging only to the people who made it, and starts belonging, in some small way, to everyone who has ever spent an evening with it, including, for tonight at least, you. So thank you again for letting it belong to you for a little while tonight too, for sitting with all 25 years of it, the good seasons and the difficult ones, the genuine creative triumphs and the genuine missteps, the lawsuits and the renewals and the recording booth and the kitchen table where all of it actually began. It's been a long story and a strange one, and I'm grateful you stayed for the whole of it. And as we let it finally rest here, 25 years deep into a story that is, in truth, still being written one new episode at a time. I hope wherever you are tonight, whatever city, whatever time zone, whatever quiet stretch of hours you carved out to be here, this was the right kind of company for it. And on that note, with the night finally settling all the way down, let's bring this long, slow story to its rest. It started small, it grew strange, it nearly ended twice, it came back stronger both times, and it is, as of tonight, still going, still recording, still drawing, still somehow finding new things to say after a quarter century on the air. That is, in the end, the whole of the story told as slowly and as completely as one evening together could allow. Rest well now, knowing the whole shape of it, from the kitchen table to tonight, from one tired young animator's first drawing all the way through to whatever new episode airs next week. And to whoever happens to be hearing this story years from now, long after tonight, long after this exact season of the show has aged into history itself, know that this is exactly how it happened, told as carefully and as honestly as the record allows, one verified fact laid gently after another. Good night, wherever and whenever you are listening from. Let this be the last thing in your ears before whatever rest comes next. And with that, the kitchen table, the recording booth, the lawsuits, the renewals, the frog, the streaming charts, and every single thread we followed tonight finally settle quietly into place, all part of one long, unlikely, still unfinished story. There's nothing left to add now except gratitude for the long hours of research and writing that went into laying all 25 years of this out in order, and for the long hours you spent tonight actually sitting with it, start to finish, without rushing past a single thread of it. That kind of patience is rare, and it's appreciated, more than any quick comment or click could ever fully say. So let the story rest here now, complete, 25 years accounted for, every thread followed all the way to its end, and let you rest too, wherever you are, however late it has gotten, however far this journey carried you tonight. 25 years, told slowly, told whole, told true, that's the story, and that's where we leave it. Thank you for staying until the very last word of it. Sleep well now, truly, completely, and thank you again, sincerely, for spending this whole long night here with this story, every single word of it. That's really the quiet thread running underneath everything we've talked about tonight. Underneath all the controversy and the lawsuits and the cast changes and the corporate mergers and the streaming numbers. Somewhere underneath all 25 years of it, there's still just one person's strange, specific, deeply personal sense of humor, scaled up across hundreds of episodes and dozens of collaborators, and two entirely different media conglomerates, somehow still recognizable, for better or worse, as the exact same voice that first imagined a dim-witted man named Larry and his sarcastic dog named Steve, sitting together in a little hand-drawn world that nobody outside a college dorm room had any reason to expect would still be running a full quarter century later. Thank you sincerely for spending this long, slow stretch of your evening with this story. If you've made it all the way here, you've earned a quiet rest. Make sure you're subscribed if you'd like to be here for the next one of these long, detailed deep dives into the hidden histories tucked inside the shows and stories we all think we already know. And if tonight helped you unwind, helped you drift towards sleep, or simply gave you something steady and unhurried to hold on to while the rest of the world quieted down around you, leave a like on your way out, so this small channel knows to keep making more of them. Sleep well wherever in the world you happen to be tonight.